Good afternoon and welcome to the October 12th Civil Service Commission meeting. And we have roll call, please.
Commissioner Hatamian.
Here.
Gregorian.
Here.
Gantis. Devine.
Here.
And for the record, Commissioner Manukian is absent.
Thank you. Before we get to the minutes, we're going to take one item out of order, the oral comments. And I'm going to ask Mr. Gantis if he'd like to make some comments for us.
I'm sorry, just a point of clarification. Are you asking for item number 3, oral comments, or are you asking for
Commission
staff
comments?
Okay,
Staff
number 12. Thank you.
Number 12.
Thank you. Today, my microphone on. Nobody can hear me. Now they can. Today, I know Mr. Doyle was present at the Glendale Fire Department Awards Luncheon. I know, Mr. Chairman, you were present. I was present. I know that I saw the chief there. I'm sure some of the command staff was there as well. I know Officer Ballesteros was there because I saw him. And we were, I think the word is, I mean, I guess if you planned it and wrote a script, you couldn't write a better script than what happened today. It could have been serious. Thankfully, it was serious. It could have been really serious, but thankfully the participant is okay. We had a speaker that I think suffered and certainly collapsed and fainted at the podium at this luncheon, and it was honoring our Glendale Fire Department and, of course, our EMT staff, et cetera. And he had collapsed in the middle of the speech, and you could hear the collective groan of the crowd. And all of us sat back. It was amazing to see the crowd sat back and watched an amazing, unbelievable performance by our Glendale Fire Department and the EMT staff as if on cue, as a machine. They took to what they needed to do. They surrounded him at the podium. Others went and got the necessary equipment, the paddles, etc., that they normally have. And everybody moved. Very little said. Everybody moved. My understanding is that in these situations, I've understood that this was a very, very high percentage that something could have happened other than what did, and the person is okay. But to watch our people in action, to watch them, and this goes also for the police department. I know the chief's here also. I've seen them in action. But to watch this today, this unbelievable machine that we have, and I say machine, it's a positive, how fast and how quickly and how competently they handled this emergency, gave me great pride in the fact that we sit up here, and I've sat here for 12 years, as you know, Mr. Chairman, and we've heard about the fire department and we've heard about the police department and how lucky we are to live in Glendale and have these people. Well, today, 300 of Glendale's finest, actually, not only the police, but business people, city staff, the honored city manager Starbird. We were treated today to watching in action, in live action, the very competent, high efficiency Glendale Fire Department and the EMT staff, with the police, by the way. They were there as well. They were helping. In fact, I saw the police car accompany the ambulance to the hospital. And we're happy to report the individual is okay, but I'm awfully certain, don't know for a fact, that this was a result of the quickness and efficiency of our Glendale Fire Department. And I, as a Civil Service Commissioner, would like to personally, as well as a citizen, thank and acknowledge that high efficiency of our fire department. Mr. Chairman, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gantis. I'm sure the same thanks and acknowledgement comes from the entire commission, and we certainly agree with your comments. Yes.
Well said.
Yes. Thank you. And with that, we'll go to the next item.
Minutes.
Okay. I was not here, so...
No, I didn't read them. I usually let you read them.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second?
I'll second.
Mr. Chair, just that there were 2 commissioners who were absent, and if either one of the absent commissioners have had the opportunity to view the meeting and can comment on the accuracy of the minutes, we may need to put this item over to the next meeting.
I did review the meeting, I watched the tape, and I can comment on the accuracy of the minutes, so I will vote on that item.
Okay, thank you.
You want to do a roll call on that?
Commissioner Hatamian.
Yes.
Gregorian.
You have to.
Yeah, I wasn't here.
Gantis.
Yes.
Devine.
Yes. Okay, may I have the next item, please?
Oral communications.
Okay, I have two cards. First card is Mr. Milano.
Commission Chair Devine, members of the Civil Service Commission and staff, my name is Herbert Milano. I'd like to take a moment to recognize some of the comments made by Mr. Gantus today with regard to the events that he saw personally today. I think that there's a high degree of proficiency and professionalism with regard to the fire department. And it comes to mind a request that I have made of the city for the past 6 years, that there be an assessment with regard to the performance of how many victims of heart attacks or strokes arrive alive at a hospital. Because this measure of performance is used in Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, and we're able to get that kind of information from them. But we don't get it from Glendale, and I think that's an opportunity that is missed. We're having that kind of level of professionalism that we should know how many people who have a heart attack arrive alive at a hospital. The main reason why I came here before you today is to address a decision that you've made, I believe last month or the month prior, with regard to the the disciplinary action that you took with regard to the 3 officers who during working hours took their trip over to the Nevada border. Because to my assessment, we need and expect solid decision-making from the police staff at all times. Because it comes a time when they are under stress or under severe, tenuous circumstances where they are going to be asked to use a gun or make some kind of very difficult decision under stress. But from my understanding, from what I read in the Glendale News Press, these 3 officers undertook that task of taking this police automobile and sustained a bad decision hour after hour after hour, meaning that they had an opportunity to correct their bad decision and turn back. And it is also my understanding that they were stopped along the way by the highway patrol. That was another opportunity for them to reassess their decision and turn back. So, as an observer, knowing how often there have been significant lawsuits against the city for performance of police officers throughout Southern California, I wonder if an individual or 3 individuals can make such a terribly bad decision and sustain it when they are not under duress or under stress, how can we then justify keeping such an officer? I don't understand that, and I hope that perhaps members of this commission could clarify your decision-making process on your decision to keep one of those officers. Frankly, I rake my head and I don't understand how you could make that decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, Barry Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commission. I'm Barry Allen with Vanguardians. I've had a number of questions since regarding things like oral boards. At what point is the public given the knowledge of the names of the people that are sitting on oral boards for various promotions or hirings? Public would like to know. They'd also like to know what exams, numbers of the people taking the exams, and the scores of the people taking the testing. They'd like to know what's available, whether there are names or whether are there just numbers and scores. They're also very concerned about the actual eligibility. If there's an eligibility that says a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, how is that actually verified? And we know there are certain diploma mills that just sell diplomas, and go sign in, and you get your diploma. How do we verify the skills that are invoked by having a degree? And these are questions that the public is asking me, and I'm asking you. And possibly we'll put it into the form of a public records request. In fact, seeing as there's a member of the attorney staff, we will make this an oral public records request. Thank you. I'm Barry Allen.
Thank you. See no more cards. Is there anyone else in the audience that wishes to address the commission on an item that's not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move to the next item, please.
Recruitment and examination status report.
Mr. Doyle?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this item represents the current activities relative to our recruitment and selection activity. As you see, the report, which is approximately a page and a third, does contain the list of the recruitment processes at various stages. It looks at the opening date, the closing date, dates of any exams that happen to be in place, and ultimately who those are assigned to. If you have any questions on these, I'd be happy to try and answer them, but this is a note and file item.
Where is
Any
my...
questions? Janice?
No, I don't think, sorry.
Okay, next item, please.
Eligible list established.
Mr. Doyle?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this item is a brief report on the eligible lists that have been established since our last meeting approximately 2 weeks ago. This current report shows a total of 4 lists that have been established involving 4 examination processes. 3 of those were promotional only. One of them was a promotional and open examination process. The report indicates the total number of applications received in one column, and then on the far right column, the total number of individuals who were successful in making it through that process. Again, this is a note and file item. If you have questions about this report or any of the specific recruitments, I'd be happy to try and answer them for you.
Any questions?
I do have a question regarding the lieutenant's exam. Are we currently taking applications for that examination, or these are prior applicants?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Hatamian, this represents the previous examination process that occurred, along with these other exams that, again, the process had concluded probably in the last 2 to 3 weeks, and the promulgation of a list occurred from that point on. So these are past exams.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. And when will this list expire?
These lists generally last for 2 years. Promotional lists, as a result of the charter, are required to go a full 2 years. Open lists can be canceled after 1 year, or as any of these lists become fully exhausted, they can be canceled as well.
Okay. And when was this specific list, specifically pertaining to the police lieutenant's exam, promulgated?
Commissioner Tommy, I don't have the exact date, but I believe it would have been probably at some point in late September. Does anyone have the? I'm looking at a member of my staff who might.
I guess my concern mainly is if and once the lieutenant's examination is approved, would individuals on this list qualify for the final interview? Or are we going to create a new list and go from there?
Commissioner Hatamian, as you can see from the report, there were 2 individuals who passed that examination process, and those individuals have since been promoted to lieutenant. In fact, the effective date was today. Therefore, that list is exhausted.
Oh, okay, it's exhausted.
We have no, okay.
Which is an item we have later on to deal with the next one.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle.
Sure.
Okay, no further questions. We'll move on to the next item.
Revised class specification for approval, meal coordinator.
Mr. Doyle?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this is a revision of a class specification for the position of meal coordinator. This is a classification within our Community Services and Parks Department, which is engaged in serving of the meals program for our senior citizens here in the city. It's a very active program. We have, I think, at various locations where we serve hot meals, nutritional meals. This specification is an attempt to update the specification. We've been bringing these to you at every meeting. This particular one has not been updated since 1992. So again, this is a part of our ongoing effort to revise these and make sure that they're contemporary. In this particular case, we are seeking a few minor changes to it, largely to broaden the applicant pool. There's language currently that states a preference for individuals with experience serving seniors, and really that's probably not necessary to have that particular experience. Really, we're interested in people who worked in the food industry, in mass feeding programs, and we feel that that's sufficient enough. Additionally, there is a certification after the individual's hired, which has been added to this job requirement, something called a ServSafe Food Protection Manager certification, which I believe is issued by LA County. That's being added as a requirement for the individual to attain within 6 months of their appointment. So with that, if you have questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. I have staff here from both my office as well as the Community Services and Parks Department.
Any questions on the meal coordinator? Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
And we'll go with unanimous consent on that. And the next item, please.
Class specification for approval, payroll specialist series.
Mr. Doyle?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this is a request for approval of a new series of 3 new classifications, payroll specialist 1, 2, and 3. We currently have a vacancy within this particular work unit, and we're seeking to do something that we've been wanting to do for a while now, and that's create a more specialized series in the payroll profession. Currently, the employees in this work unit in payroll carry titles that are associated with the generic accounting series, accounting assistant, accounting specialist, and really over time the payroll profession has become very specialized. Individuals who work in payroll need to know lots of information about state and federal wage and hour laws, Fair Labor Standards Act, tax regulations, as well as being familiar with city policies or MOUs and such. There are professional organizations out there that specialize in payroll, publications out there. It's a very, very complex and specialized series. Thus, we're recommending that this series be addressed. What we're planning to do, if the Commission does approve this series, is to take the individuals currently in these positions, in these accounting positions, and laterally transfer them over to the new payroll series. And as I said, there's a vacancy at one of the levels, and we'll be doing a recruitment for that as well. But again, this is something we've been wanting to do again for a while, and we feel this is the time to do it. And by the way, about 4 or 5 years ago, we did create a payroll supervisor classification at the middle management level. Again, previously, the person in charge of payroll was an accounting supervisor, and we found it to be a lot more effective to be able to recruit for somebody with that specific background as opposed to somebody with a general accounting background, and it's worked out quite well. So we're seeking to do that at the lower ranks within this work group. So with that, if you have any questions, be happy to try and answer them. Again, I do have staff from both Human Resources and Finance who can answer any specific questions as well.
Thank you. Any questions on payroll?
Yes.
Dorian?
These changes, is going to affect on the budget?
None, Commissioner Gregorian, none whatsoever. Any changes in this in personnel associated with this will be done on a lateral basis. So as an example, individuals who are currently at the senior accounting technician level will be moved over to the payroll specialist 2 level. Individuals at the I believe it's a senior accounting specialist position will be moved over to the payroll specialist 1 level. It's a purely lateral move, which shouldn't require any additional costs.
I do have one question. What is the main purpose of doing these lateral transfers and creating these positions?
Once again, Commissioner Natamian, it is to really establish and recognize the specialty area of payroll. As I said in my report, the people currently in these jobs have a general accounting background, and that's a good background to have, but payroll, we found, is a little more specialized than just general accounting, and as I said, there are specialized rules and regulations that people who work in payroll have to know. As I said, tax law, overtime law, regulations relating to various things, payroll associated, as well as they have to be familiar with our MOUs and how to interpret the various special codes and special pays that we have here at the City of Glendale. So it's really just a matter of specialization.
I guess my question is more directed towards the current classification that we've created that we want approval for. Have we added additional requirements in here?
Certainly.
And that's what I'm mainly concerned with, if you can just kind of highlight those for us so we understand a little bit better as to what the new qualifications are.
Certainly. As an example, you can see even in the payroll specialist one, we talk about the various things that they would be working on, processing W-4 forms, employment verifications. The minimum requirement for payroll specialist one specifically states 2 years of experience working in a payroll unit or section. The comparable position in the accounting series wouldn't require that. At the payroll specialist 2 level, we're seeking 3 years experience working specifically in payroll. We're asking for an associate degree at that level. There's licenses and certifications that become part of this that, again, were not part of the general accounting series. This FPC certification, the CPP certifications, that's what we're after here.
Okay, so the candidates, when they transfer over to these new positions that you're asking us to create, will have to have these minimum requirements, including the education, at the time of the transfer.
That is correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Yeah, so moved.
Second.
Revised class specification for approval, police supervisory and management series, and open job bulletin for approval, police lieutenant.
Mr. Doyle?
Okay, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this item has 2 parts to it. One is a revision of the class specification for this police supervisory management series. Within that series, you have a rather significant change to the specific classification of police lieutenant, and then the second part is an approval of the revised job bulletin for that classification of police lieutenant. With regard to the class specification, and I'll say in both of these actions this evening, an effort is being made to broaden the potential applicant pool for our upcoming police lieutenant examination process. The main change that's being proposed relative to the class spec is a modification into the minimum requirements that currently state that the individual would have to be employed with the City of Glendale as a police sergeant. This item, the bulletin is seeking to broaden this to make it a promotional and open recruitment process, and in order to do so, we'd have to have some language that would enable outside candidates to apply. So that's really the primary change relative to the specification, again, to permit outside candidates at the rank of lieutenant and a California post agency to apply. There are also modifications of the post certificates within the specification. Glendale employees would be required to have possession of or be eligible to possess the supervisory and advanced post certificate. Again, candidates from the outside would be required to possess or be eligible to possess the post management level certificate. So again, this would enable consideration of outside candidates at that rank of lieutenant or above. Part 2 of this is the bulletin for approval. As you know, members of the Commission, not all job bulletins come before you. On occasion, we do bring job bulletins before you when it involves an executive recruitment, when it involves a public safety promotional recruitment, or a recruitment where we're modifying or proposing to modify the minimum qualifications that would deviate from the approved class specification. In this particular case, the job bulletin is being modified from the approved specification in that there's an allowance of a 2-year time frame from the time of appointment for the attainment of a bachelor's degree. Currently, the classification does require a bachelor's degree. What's being proposed is a modification to that, which would enable, after 2 years, a 2-year time frame to attain that degree. Once again, this is being done as a primary objective would be to broaden the candidate pool. We recently had a recruitment process for police lieutenant, and as you saw from the earlier report on your agenda of the eligible list that have been established, we had a total of 8 candidates total apply, and 2 made the eligible list. We anticipate several openings at the lieutenant level, and again, this seeking of a promotional and open recruitment process would potentially enable us to get more candidates for this position and to meet what our anticipated hiring needs will be for the next 6 months to 2 years. The Chief of Police is here, and I'll allow him to come up and speak, but I will say that he has encouraged all employees at the level of sergeant to step up and apply for this position. But as I said earlier, we've been a little disappointed at the number who have applied. Thus, why we're here tonight recommending a promotional and open process. 2 weeks ago, we met here, and what the chief was proposing was an open recruitment process for this position. And we had a number of individuals here from the GPOA, as well as their labor attorney. Just prior to the start of the meeting, all the parties involved requested that this be carried over for an additional meeting to see if we could come to some resolution on some of the areas where we had differences of opinion. Since that time, there have been meetings with our GPOA, along with the chief and my staff, and as a compromise, it's our understanding that the GPOA is accepting of the move to allow an additional 2 years to obtain the bachelor's degree. From the management end, the chief has gone from desiring an open-only recruitment process to a promotional and open process, which means essentially we would accept candidates from the outside. However, internal candidates would be considered prior to candidates from the outside. Those who pass the exam, we would have 2 lists established, one for promotional candidates, one for open candidates, and the candidates on the the promotional list would have to be certified first before the candidates or any candidates from the outside, and that's regardless of score. So that's the sort of in a nutshell the things that have occurred since our last meeting. Once again, the Chief of Police is here this evening, and I believe he does want to address the Commission if that's your desire at this time.
Okay. Chief?
Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission. We would like to give you just some background as to why we are requesting this policy change. Obviously, historically, we have promoted into our management ranks below the position of Chief of Police from internally. But we are experiencing some very unique times in that our management staff is a tenured management staff. Years ago when we implemented the 3% at 50 retirement system, we knew moving that retirement age to an earlier level would ultimately someday catch up with us and affect us in terms of losing valuable experience and tenured individuals. And we are currently experiencing that now. That, coupled with the fact that the economic recession has certainly brought about salary and benefit concessions on the part of the management group, and certainly the ever-present potential for pension reform going forward. And even though we had done, I think, a best effort as we could to plot out potential retirements in the future and put together what we thought was a pretty comprehensive succession plan, I think the combination of all these factors have, in essence, caused people to move their retirement dates up, and we're experiencing that now. So let me just give you an example. We have a sworn management staff of 15. That's the chief of police, 4 division captains, and 10 bureau commander lieutenants. Just by way of information, that is actually the same sworn management staff and staffing levels that we had in 1955. So we operate this department in a very lean management and command structure comparatively to other agencies, and just looking historically at how the agency and the complexity of policing this community has changed. So currently, given that 15, we have 80% of those that are either currently retired, currently eligible to retire, or will be eligible to retire within the 2-year life of a new promotional list. So obviously not everybody goes when they're eligible to retire, and I'm probably living proof of that, as I'm still here. But nonetheless, that is a liability we have to plan for. And if we proceed just getting 6, 7, 8 candidates for this very important management position, we will not be able to sustain the leadership team, and we will not be able to do what we need to do in not only the immediate future, but over the course of the next 2 years. While we don't have a crystal ball, I didn't predict the level of retirements that we'd experience in 2011, but they were far above anything that we imagined. So I don't know what the future holds, but we do know that we have immediate openings that lie ahead. Fortunately, we were able to promote 2 today, 2 very good candidates, and that's a real godsend for us. But there's going to be other eminent openings, and the potential of having anywhere from 7 to 8 openings all the way up to 11 or 12 openings over the course of the next 2 years. So we simply have to have the candidate pool to sustain the leadership team in the department. Now, some would argue that, well, why don't we just use actings and make a sergeant an acting commander? And while that can certainly be a short-term stopgap measure, that is not a wise position to be in that our supervisors need to be involved in field supervision, not running a bureau command. And so it is not a wise move to proceed that way. We simply need to have a sustainable list that we can fill our leadership ranks, and I have every confidence that we will do so from within. We have tremendous leadership in the ranks of our supervisors. However, this last process, some that were eligible decided that they did not want to pursue this management position. We had some that were very close in terms of the educational requisite that were prohibited from throwing their hat in the ring. And so here's what we're hoping, is that by making these modifications as suggested, that we will get an adequate pool from inside, that we will have individuals that perhaps have a change of heart and will answer the leadership call internally and step up to compete for these management positions, number one. And number two, that some window of time to complete the educational requirement will allow a few other very good candidates to throw their hat in the ring as well. And my hope is that by doing that, we will have an internal pool of candidates that will sustain our needs at least for the next year. However, at the end of the day, as your chief of police, I have a responsible for ensuring that we can sustain a leadership team for the Glendale Police Department. And to that end, if for some reason we don't get adequate candidates, we simply need that open process as a bit of insurance and an opportunity to perhaps bring other qualified managers from other similarly sized and situated agencies into the competitive process.
Okay, I think that was a very excellent presentation. I think before we get in, we have some oral communication cards here. Do you have any questions, first of all, of the chief? Commissioners?
I do have one question, Chief. Thank you for being here. I guess one of the concerns that I have, just looking at the educational, and I'll just jump right into it, the educational and training background requirements and the 2-year timeline to obtain the education requirement. And it's very hard for me to compare this to other examinations that we've approved so far. But just on lower level positions within the city, I've never seen, not only within the city, but within my line of work, which is law enforcement and risk management, I've never seen a minimum requirement where the requirement simply isn't there at the time of the application and where there's a timeline. And I understand that the GPOA and yourself have met and conferred regarding this matter. However, considering the high-level nature of this position, that's one of the issues that I'm having, and I was wondering if you can just reassure us on that and as to the reasoning behind and the rationale behind having this minimum requirement, which at the time of the application, when it's filed, we can call it a minimum requirement. However, at the time when it's filed, it seems like it needs its own subheading because the requirement isn't there at the time when they file it.
Certainly, and Commissioner Hatami, and let me respond, and it's really kind of a multifaceted response. Number one, while we have certainly philosophically made a commitment to ensuring that formal education is part of the requisite requirement for being a police manager, when you look comparatively in the industry, it's not an absolute. It's really a mixed bag, and that other agencies that you will look at have far less of a requirement in terms of education than what we're requiring for the rank of lieutenant. In fact, I'm not sure if the Sheriff's Department requires a 4-year degree for lieutenant. I don't believe they do. But that's not unusual. So while we certainly intend to continue to support that philosophy, we want the level of sophistication and problem solving and critical thinking that comes with higher education. If we restrict our internal candidate pool to that mandate without some degree of accomplishing it in other means, we simply will not have enough internal candidates. We simply will not have enough. And so these, as I noted, they're very unique, special times. This is not something that we're coming to you and asking as a permanent change. This is to meet very special needs for this very, very unique and special time period. I think there's different opportunities in that 2-year window for the department to ensure that requisite is completed. Prior to appointment, we can confirm that candidate that's eligible is enrolled in a bona fide program. Prior to completing probation, if they are promoted, we can ensure that they've made the requisite progress in that program to give us a high degree of confidence that they will complete it. And then at the 2-year mark, if they fail to do so, which I can't imagine at a command level that anybody would do that, but you certainly have the ability to deal with them as not meeting the standards of the position required, and deal with it as a disciplinary matter.
I respect your answer, Chief, and if you allow me to further dive into this. And I do respect the fact that we have a little comparison between Glendale PD and the Sheriff's Department. However, I think the standards are a little bit different, especially pertaining to pay and just within the community itself. And with the secondary issue of not having enough candidates if we don't leave the educational aspect open. At this time, I'm not sure if Glendale Police Department has canvassed itself to determine whether or not there are enough applicants with a bachelor's degree. And I guess the main hurdle that I'm having here is if we're going to call it a minimum requirement, and if we're going to approve an examination where we call it a minimum requirement, at the time of when the application is filed, we're calling it a minimum requirement, so it needs to be met. If we're going to label this as something new and set precedents where we approved, I don't know, a few examinations tonight, then it's very difficult to not allow that opportunity, not only within the police department, but other agencies within the city. So that's the main hurdle I'm having, and I'm wondering if the commissioners would like to chime in on this issue at all.
What I'd like to do, I think that's a very good point. What I had planned to do is hear the Chief's comments. I do have a couple of academic questions so I can get clarification, allow the public to speak, and once we get all the information, then have the commission deliberate on that.
Agreed.
Well, I think Mr. Chairman, I'd also want to elaborate on, I agree with you, but I would like to get a little more comment from the chief before we deliberate more interaction with the chief after the oral comments, to address just that issue. I have to tell you,
it's an important issue.
It's an extraordinarily important issue. I've been here for 12 years, and Mr. Chairman, I can tell you this is among the top 5, in my mind, decisions that we've made in the public arena of this, because it's such a change in my mind that we're going into. So I think Mr. Atamian's comments are most appropriate and his questions are most appropriate.
But I'd like to get all the information
I agree.
out on the table so we have something to...
I agree. Sure.
Okay. With that, I do have some, what I'm going to call academic questions just on the bulletin itself and the specs. I noticed on the original job specs, one of the education requirements was attainment of supervisory and advanced post certificates, and that has been changed under this new proposal to says current or Glendale police sergeants must possess or be eligible for the attainment of the supervisory post certificates. And I was kind of confused on that. We were just talking about the requirements for the BA and the BS degrees and extending the time to get those, but all we said here, we changed the requirements from possessing these post certificates to being eligible for them. And I'm wondering if you could explain why that's become something that's not required at this time.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask the Chief to respond to that.
Certainly, Mr. Chair, it deals with the fact that many times there's a backlog in applying for the certificates through the state. The Post Commission is where we make application for those particular certificates. Sometimes it can take literally months for those to be processed at the state level and come back. So by the technicality of having to have that in possession, you may exclude a candidate that is merely waiting for the certificate to come in the mail. And so this alleviates that and sets aside the state backlog from impacting a candidate.
Okay, but when you use the terminology or be eligible for, does that mean that at that point he is entitled to that certificate? He's done whatever requirements are needed to be done, and as you say, it's just a matter of processing it through the mail? Or does it mean he has to take another exam or whatever he needs to do to qualify for the certificate?
Mr. Chair, it means that they have met all the qualifications for achieving that, and it's merely an issue of going through the process.
Okay. The second thing, and again, this is just a dotting the i's and crossing the t's, on the new job specs, it says a BA or BS degree is required, and of course we're talking about extending the time for that. But I notice on the police captain job specs, it said in the areas of police science, public administration, and whatnot, and this bulletin is silent on that. I'm wondering if that's something you wanted to add in just for clarification, that not every BA or BS would be acceptable. It has to be in certain areas.
You know, Mr. Chair and members of Commission, while I think that's desirable, that we get a direct relationship between the field of study and the profession, I have to tell you that philosophically, I don't think it's mandatory. I think merely the fact that an applicant goes through the formal education process, again, it develops a level of sophistication, decision-making, critical thinking that is very beneficial to being a manager.
All right, so with that reasoning, is there a reason why you would put that in, or you'd have put that in for the education requirement on the police captain and not the police lieutenant?
I think, Mr. Chair, that was probably an oversight.
Certainly.
So to make them consistent, would you recommend deleting the requirements under police captain in the areas of, or adding them to the police lieutenant?
Mr. Chair, we could do that. I would think it would be more effective to add them to the police lieutenant as opposed to taking it away from the captain, just because we want to encourage the attainment of the degree and focus the individuals into these very broad areas, and they are broad areas: police science, public administration, business administration, and when you say or a related field, that could be just about anything. So,
Except it can't be an engineer. We know that.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, and the last question I had, and again, this will be up for discussion if we get further into this issue, but just again, academically, considering that some of the candidates may have, in fact, their BA degrees or BS degrees, and they'd be competing against now people that may not have them, what would be your thoughts on adding a bonus or some type of incentive to the people that do have the BA degrees when you're making your final decision from the top three candidates?
And Mr. Chair, members of Commission, I think obviously we're very familiar with preference points, and they've been applied in other topical areas. I think the same could be done here. I have no objection to that at all. I think it might be a very fair approach.
So when all is said and done, if we come up with the final process here, you would have no objection to putting that in as one of the requirements or steps?
No, sir, I would not.
Well, those are all the questions I have at this point. Let's go ahead and hear from the public, and then we'll get back into deliberations. And the first card I have is from Herbert Milano.
Commission Chair Devine, members of the Civil Service Commission, my name is Herbert Milano. I support the Chief with regard to his intent to broaden the eligibility list, because I believe that a police department that broadens its overall set of experience from other police departments would be beneficial. Glendale, for example, has very few murders. If you were to bring a police lieutenant from a city that has a significant number of murders, you're bringing in quite a significant amount of experience into its ranks. What I disagree with is the lowering of the educational requirement for many reasons. Here are some of them. We are in the information age. We buy and purchase and spend a significant amount of money on expensive computer systems. We focus, or should be focusing, on analysis. We got to be looking at analysis of trends. We have to be looking and evaluating at best practices with regard to those analyses from other law enforcement agencies. We purchase DNA, and we are doing some sophisticated work with regard to that area of law enforcement. Now let's take a look at some of the problems that generally are found in many police departments. Wrongful arrests, wrongful incarcerations, wrongful convictions. And that's just some of the problems that many police departments have. let's take a look at some of the requirements that a police lieutenant and others in management should have. A careful study of human psychology, careful study of human statistics, a study of probability, a practice on critical thinking and demonstratively with regard to classes in personnel and evaluation, and cultural and social studies as well. We have, in addition, complex crimes. We have sophisticated white-collar crime. We have fraud and embezzlement. We have various different complex crimes as they're coming due to the nature of the information age. And we also have some of the other social problems having to do with domestic violence and the issues that those bring up. So as you can see, the requirements are even higher and more demanding. We had a challenge here in the city of Glendale, and that's with regard to eyewitness testimony and a problem that the city had with regard to a lawsuit with regard to a wrongful incarceration that cost us millions of dollars. But the literature is extensive with regard to the problems in eyewitness testimony, police lineups and so forth. If a police lieutenant and a person is not driven to that education, driven to learn, and is not demonstrated currently, then I wonder if that individual is not going to be ready and willing to look at new information and read it on his own to become more self-educated with regard to issues that are not necessarily brought to their attention. My conclusion is as follows, that we should be raising the standards, not lowering them. That we need to expand the pool of applicants that can bring best practices from police departments that have significantly more complex workloads than they are in the city of Glendale. I believe that the city of Glendale, being as safe as it is, would be a very attractive place given an equivalent type of salary for someone who comes in from very stressful environments. Let's not lower the bar for qualifications. Let's make it very specific as to the range of skill sets that are needed in order that we can avoid lawsuits in the future and raise the level of competency with regard to what we expect from our police lieutenants. In the past, whenever there has been a request for comparable pay, the city always looks at other departments and say, how high are they earning? I don't think we want to compare a salary to the highest and then the qualifications to the lowest. It's incomparable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. I'm Barry Allen. I will not cover the same area that Mr. Milano did, but I want you to know I'm in complete agreement with his comments regarding raising the bar instead of lowering it. Now, the people that are eligible for this promotion, who are city police officers now, have known what the requirements were for lieutenant. They've known what they were for sergeant. They know all of the requirements because they're published. And they also get education payments. They decide to go to school, they're paid. Now, if these people had, and I think one of the words you're looking for, initiative. If they had the initiative to increase their acumen in their police work, then there wouldn't be this question. But now we're trying to lower the standard and say, well, tell you what, we'll make you a lieutenant now, and if you get your bachelor's degree in a couple of years, you'll be okay. Now, I really have some problems with that. And in my lifetime, that isn't complete, fortunately, I have mentored a lot of young police officers, people that started as cadets, people that started in patrol, and we have talked about where their career paths should go. And the ones that I have mentored are now assistant chiefs of police and police chiefs throughout the country because they took that tack of education. Some of them are attorneys, which certainly plays well in law enforcement. You can just take a look at the requirements of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the number of people from that agency, that bureau, that I've worked with in the last 6 years. And they're very talented people. They certainly don't get paid what police officers here get paid, but they do their job. And so we're lacking an initiative. Now, I also note that they're changing the requirements, I guess, for this offering only, this promotion only. Then we're going to go back. Are there people that we're just trying to promote so that they can get that retire with lieutenant's pay? Is that what we're trying to do? Or are we trying to better this police department? I would hope it would be the latter. Now, I also noticed that there are situations where you want to bring in someone from another department, all right? And we want to bring them in so they can start before January the 1st. Well, obviously, somebody coming in from another department doesn't know the rules and regulations and the procedures in this department. So why don't we start them where they're coming from another agency under the new pension plan, as spelled out in the document? And I really think that we have to look at why it's for this recruitment only. I know it's urgent, but maybe some of the captains can take on a little bit more of a role and a little bit more of a workload, and possibly there are more of them that have retired and come back under the 960 plan. And what this has shown me is that when we bring these people back, and the reason I'm given is, well, they have to train the new people. Come on. We build a pipeline. We train people as we on-go. And if we're not doing it, it shows there's a problem with the police management as it stands. They are not being able to anticipate this. Now, I had been told back in December of last year about 25 retirements in the police department. And if I know it as just an outsider, obviously the people sitting in the across the street should know that. Thank you. I'm Barry Allen.
Who's Mike? Oh.
I got it. Thank you. Could you pronounce your name for us?
Yes, sir. Tigran Topajikian. I have some handouts I'd like to give.
Certainly.
Mr. Chairman, I would suggest maybe that those handouts be given to our counsel and then she can distribute them, if that would be appropriate with you.
Fine. Okay, please continue.
Yes. Good evening, honorable members of the Commission, the City Attorney, staff, and Mr. Doyle. I speak as a matter of public concern today, and I'm not speaking out against management. I'd like to point out some facts from the memo that's been submitted to Civil Service from the HR department, and I'll get to that. I've got a very short amount of time. But the education requirements were increased under Chief Anthony approximately 10 to 15 years ago, and they were incrementally increased to include up to the level of a bachelor's. And Chief DePompa, having been with our organization for 33 years plus, was a commanding member of the organization when they were increased. Law enforcement is a profession, just like the medical profession, the legal profession, and we need to maintain the standards that have been set in place by the Civil Service Commission. It's a managerial position, the police lieutenant position, and it states so right in the class specifications that's sitting in front of the Civil Service Commission today. The requirements were increased for the police captain position just approximately a year ago, and there was an attempt at the lowering of the standards approximately 1 year ago, but that did not move forward. while this may broaden the applicant pool, realistically, it may only be broadened by getting 2 to 3 additional people to apply. Chief talked about a probationary review. Well, and the individual won't pass probation, or if they do, a scaly process where they'll be going through a demotion process in essence. There attaches the constitutional rights of the due process. Property rights are granted with the pay increase. There's already been adverse law about the 5% administrative pay, where people move from a non-patrol position to an administrative assignments, and the courts have litigated that. This certainly opens up an area where it's uncharted waters, or could potentially even attach to constitutional rights. And the Civil Service Commission would have to be, again, going through, having hearings to go through a demotion of a police lieutenant back to the sergeant position. I'd like to state that every individual has had an equal opportunity in the police department to attain their educational goals. They brought the campus to the police department. Cal State Long Beach came with their professors and taught and spoke. And many members of the department took advantage of some of those programs. And they also had the opportunity to continue after the program stopped at the police department with their formalized education. I passed out the civil service rule on page 2 in the bottom, where the civil service rule states that there's 30 days after the application period for individuals to meet the requirement, the minimum requirements. Civil service was set up, the process of civil service, as a system to ensure that all employees have equal access and there's fairness throughout the processes. If a rule is going to be modified or altered, there's other rules that can potentially be asked to be modified or altered too. Mr. Hartamian brought up other class specifications. We have a 70% passing score. Well, if we were to lower that to 65% today, you'd have 6 lieutenants on the list. But is that a direction that civil service wants to take? You lower, one civil service rule, you go to opening up to, asking for other rules to be lowered. The other issue is that this is for this testing bulletin only. Well, future bulletins, and people would certainly come and say, well, it was lowered for this bulletin. Why am I not being allowed to participate and lower the bulletin then? Well, it looks like my time is up, and some of it was passing out the paperwork, but thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Perfect timing.
Good. Okay, with that, I'll turn to commissioners and ask for their comments.
Mr. Chairman, mine are going to be rather questioning and extensive comments. Chief, if I could ask you, one of the questions I have is academic. We do not require, I'm looking at the job bulletin, Mr. Doyle and Chief, for the supervisory and management series. We do not, to become a sergeant, you need to have 60 college semester units. Does that qualifies you for an AA degree then? Is that correct?
Yes.
So before they can be a sergeant, they must complete 60 units, and to achieve a BA, you need 120.
It's approximately 120,
Okay.
yes, depending on the school.
Okay, that answers my question then, because I didn't see that, but I would take it though. I guess we are always going to have somebody under the police lieutenant application, if we were to approve this, that is starting off with at least 60 college units, even if we get from outside existing police lieutenants. Is that correct?
Mr. Gantis, it may not be correct, because if someone had attained the rank of sergeant a long time ago, prior to the AA degree requirement being put into place, then they may not have either the AA degree or the 60 semester units. But anyone appointed probably in the last 5 years would have that.
Well, my point would be that for the bulletin, or really even for the job, for the job spec, we would, to apply, one would have to have at least an AA degree to apply. In other words, if we're going to allow the 2-year period, they need to at least have an AA degree to apply, and then be, am I correct?
Mr. Gantis, if I might respond there, I do believe that when we have 34 sergeants in the organization, and probably 90% of them or better have been promoted under that educational requirement. So I would say that there's a high probability that a lieutenant applicant would have that, at least that baseline.
From outside, I'm talking about.
Oh, from outside?
I'm going to outside. In other words, I'm saying that we have kind of a space here that we're not saying for the lieutenant that you at least have an AA degree and then apply to complete in 2 years. I would think you'd need to have that at a minimum.
What we're requiring from the outside is twofold. One, that they be currently employed already as a police lieutenant in a California post agency, number one. And number two, that they have a post-management certificate, which requires 2 years of in-grade experience at the lieutenant's rank, along with substantial education to complete that certificate.
So we don't need to put in there, in your estimation, that's not a hole in there that they not have an AA degree. That's probably something they would have. Okay. Getting to that issue of the management, I note that we say for a Glendale police sergeant, they must possess or be eligible for a supervisory and advanced post certificates. But the full-time police lieutenant from other post agencies must possess or be eligible for a post-management certificate. Are those different requirements?
Commissioner Gantis, yes, they are. You're not eligible to attain a management certificate until you've done 2 years in grade as a sworn police manager in the state of California. There would be again, the assumption that they would also possess at the minimum a supervisory certificate as well as an advanced certificate prior to even promoting into manager.
So the supervisory and advanced certificates are generally obtained prior to the management certificate?
That is correct.
Okay, so that basically then for the police lieutenant, that basically says you have had to have been a police lieutenant at another agency for 2 years before we're going to take you in, and that's not a requirement for us for the Glendale for our own sergeants, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Let me now give some of my input. Let me ask this question. I am concerned. I sit on 2 scholarship committees, so I've looked at college people, and the requirement that we have them enrolled in a college course doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to complete that college course. They may not complete it. I would like to have some sort of a requirement that at the end of their probation, any successful candidate will have completed, I'll just throw out a number, 20 to 25 units toward their bachelor, BA, or BS, so that we have some sort of a motivational tool that we know and a standard that we have to be able to determine at the end of the probation period how far they have achieved going toward their goal. And I put 20 or 25 because typically if we're mid-semester, there's only certain periods of time. They can do a semester and maybe a summer, so that's why I might do something less. How does that sound to you?
Mr. Gantis, I like the philosophical approach to that. However, logistically, it may be very difficult to complete 25 units in a 12-month period. It's just
so they got to complete 60 units in a 24-month period.
Well, let me speak to that. It may be very difficult, and it may prove insurmountable for a candidate looking at that requirement. I do want to speak because there was a reference that, well, this is an issue of a lack of initiative on some candidates not to move forward. And I would disagree with that. I think it's less an issue of initiative and more an issue of timing, because from what I know, personally in the organization, is we have several candidates that have been going to school that are very close, but by virtue of timing, they don't have it completed. I know some that will have it completed either at the end of the year or in June of 2012. So I think with the candidates that we're hoping to entice into the process, it's an issue of timing. It's not an issue of initiative, number one. And number two, we're only talking about a very small amount of units that they're going to have to complete in order to meet that requirement.
So how would that be? I mean, I don't care the number, but I just want to see some minimum level of completion.
And I agree with that approach, and I think that's very doable. That we set some kind of benchmark that they have to achieve to show that their good faith to accomplish it. And quite honestly, if they haven't made the requisite progress in the probationary period, they will be dismissed.
Well, I hate to leave it what the word requisite means. I mean, let me just step back a minute, Chief. Here's where my thought pattern comes. You and I have discussed this. I think I've discussed it with Todd and probably Captain Povolitis. I've also discussed it with, we have lieutenants that have been, that are currently sitting. We have Tigran over here that have achieved this goal. They go to night school. They stay out. They've done the work. I don't necessarily agree with whoever said the lack of initiative, but it's certainly there. There are people that actually went way beyond that did this, and these people, I've heard from them as well, and they're saying, wait a minute, I did it. Why couldn't somebody else have done it? And so I'm hearing you. Believe me, Chief. I'm not, and everybody here will tell you my position for 12 years has been, do not dumb down a position. And that's, I've fought this. I've lost sleep over it. Believe me, it's a very difficult decision. So when I say that, I don't want people coming in that are not serious about this. And that's where I'm coming from. That's why I want that minimum, so I know that they not only enrolled, they've completed some as well, so that we have some sort of a measure to do that. I do very much want to keep it within the Glendale community. It's served us extremely, extremely well. But I've heard what's going on. I understand what's going on. I know that there are people that don't apply. We don't have enough. The 3% at 50 has caused us a problem. And so I'm prepared to listen, but I need some comfort level that I'm seeing that when we have these people, that there is some level of completion on this.
And Mr. Gantis, members of the Commission, we agree with that. I think that makes good sense. However, I will tell you that from my assessment, I don't think that this move is suddenly going to cause that candidate who doesn't have the initiative, that's sitting just on the bare minimum 60 units, to want to proceed. I don't know how they would complete 60 units in a 2-year period and be successful in a probationary period and handle all the rigors of a command. I don't think that's the type of candidate that we're going to get, number one, and I don't think that type of candidate is going to be successful anyway in the process. Again, I do think there are the candidates out there in our organization now, albeit small, there may be 3 or 4, that did have the initiative, that have been going to school, that are close, but by virtue of timing, they're going to be excluded. And I'm saying that this is a strategy that we can use to get those individuals into the process, to give us that lifeline that we need with the right type of individual that is committed to higher education, that it has been working on it, and that is close, and that can very reasonably attain that standard given a little time. I think that is given the unique circumstances we're in, that is in the best interest of this department, and that is in the best interest of this community.
So where do we go from the completion requirements? Is that something you'll accept, or you just want to leave it the requisite?
Well, I almost think that perhaps that needs to be established on a case-by-case basis. and that maybe it be done as part of a performance contract at the time of appointment. I don't necessarily think there's a one-size-fits-all, but if we were to, I think, reasonably, you could probably look at a 12-unit per year completion time period. I think that's a reasonable load to carry.
So what you're saying is we're not going to get a candidate that needs 60 units in 2 years. We're going to get a candidate that probably needs 20 to 30 units to complete.
Or less, yes.
Or less. Because they just physically are not, they just can't do that and complete the requirements.
Correct.
And let me ask this. Let's assume we appoint somebody. So, that would be a criteria that I would assume, look at on the hiring scale. Obviously, you get the list of 3, and you've got to have somebody that has the ability to have a plan for success, because we don't want to have, okay.
That is absolutely correct. That would be part of my evaluation as a department head making the hiring decision.
Mr. Doyle, are we comfortable with that, or do we think we need to have? I'm getting more comfortable. I'm not sure I am comfortable, but I do like the idea of some sort of a minimum level of, or maybe reversing it, saying that at the end of 1 year, maybe they need only 12 units to complete their BA. I'll take it on the reverse, or 15, or whatever the chief would say. Or are we comfortable with this?
Commissioner Gandis, I think we're comfortable with sort of a case-by-case basis approach, and we've discussed this with the chief already, and we even have drafted individual employment agreements for similar circumstances such as this. In fact, I've drafted a few of them, and they're under review by legal, where I think after X period of time, the individual would have to show some demonstrated proof of progress toward that degree. Certainly, just prior to the completion of the 1-year probationary period, and then once again, obviously, after the 2 years or prior to the 2 years. But I think it's doable. It's something that we've done in other departments, and it's the rare circumstance where we would allow someone to compete who's just shy of the requisite college degree. So I think it's doable.
And then as a follow-up to that, how do we handle Mr. Commissioner or Chairperson Devine's brownie points for the what was that again? I've lost that. Where you get extra points for being.
If you possess the BA or BS degree, and you're on the list, how do you handle that?
Yeah, that would be my. Do we put in here that they get an extra point, or does that? How is that handled?
Commissioner Gantis, Chair Devine, that is certainly something that can be done. It's extremely rare. The civil service rules do provide for veterans' preference points, and it's laid out specifically in the rules. Other than that, this is not commonly done. But your approval tonight of this employment bulletin would be effectively the charging document for what we would determine to be the minimum requirements for this position. And if you direct us to, in the selection procedure, to grant some form of preference points, whether it's 5 points for having that degree, we would certainly have to incorporate that in the bulletin. So it's well known to everyone up front. I would insist that should we go this way, that it be made clear that the individual would have to otherwise pass all of the components of the examination,
of course, and
receive those 5 points or whatever after they've passed it. I wouldn't want a situation where you have an individual who fails one portion of it with a score of 67, but has the degree and is brought over to a passing score of 70. I don't feel that would be appropriate. But, under those circumstances, this is certainly doable if that's the desire of the commission.
Well, I understand what you're saying, and that's one way of handling it. But what I had in mind when I mentioned the bonus points is once they're on the list and the chief has the 3 candidates or however many, if that's where the bonus would be applied.
And that's what he's saying.
And that's...
Well, what I understand you're saying is the extra points would get them in the top 3. But what I'm saying, once they're in the top 3, that the chief would then have to consider the candidates that have the BA and give them extra credit or whatever in picking his top choice or picking the one.
Chair Devine, probably the simplest way to do it would be similar to how we handle veterans credit points. And essentially, in that system, the candidate does have to pass the exam, and if they meet certain criteria, whether they're a veteran or disabled veteran, they get even more points. That simply gets tacked on to their score, and that's probably the easiest way to accomplish this, if this is what you're suggesting.
It might be the easiest way, but in terms of what we're doing here, and we are doing something that's out of the ordinary, I want to level the playing field for the candidates that do have the BA or BS degree. And to me, that will only come into play, and I'm going to assume that those candidates would probably automatically be at the top of the list just from the interviews and the written exams they take. So my concern is that, let's say we have a list, we have the top 3 candidates, one of those has a BA or BS degree, the other 2 do not. And at this point, the chief has to pick one of those 3 for the appointment. I wanted to make it so that the chief would be obligated to look at and take the one that has the BA degree as opposed to the one that does not. And to me, that would be the only way, in my mind, we could level the playing field for the candidates that did put the initiative in to get their BA at this time.
Chair Devine, I understand what you're saying, but there are 2 problems with that. Number one, we are required at the conclusion of this exam to assign a score, and that's the part of this process that is under the control of the commission. It's, the scoring, the selection, the various phases of the selection process. And that's what you'd be approving this evening. Once the top 3 candidates do get forwarded to the appointing authority, in this case the chief of police, he has a complete discretion on who to select, whether it's someone with a degree or without a degree or someone who's 3 units short. That is the appointing authority's discretion, and that is beyond the authority of the HR department, the Civil Service Commission. That becomes the chief's sole discretion at that point. So that's why for us to that we should select someone over someone else would be a level of authority that this commission just doesn't have. And again, sir, if you want to make it 7 points or 10 points, that's all fair game. But again, once the names, those 3 names, are certified to the department, to the appointing authority, I can't tell the chief who to pick. You can't tell him. It's completely up to him as to who he selects. Our authority stops when that examination is completed.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I asked our counsel to pull up a section of the rules regarding the credit, the supplemental examination credit that's available for veterans. And again, as Mr. Doyle said, it's for persons who receive a passing grade in the examination. That's the prerequisite. They are entitled to additional percentage credits as follows. A disabled veteran gets 10%, and all other veterans, unmarried widow or widower of a veteran, get 5%, and then the spouse of a disabled veteran gets 10%. I think I know Mr. Doyle is correct. Unfortunately, we're limited. We got this decision from legal about just before you were on the commission. We're limited on what we can do, and we are not we do not have the authority to hire and fire. Our authority is to conduct for the good of the service, I think the charter says. So my suggestion would be, I think what it does, though, is it puts that person in the position where they can be chosen by giving them that credit. And I would probably agree to the 5% credit after one attains a passing grade, which is what Mr. Doyle said. So in other words, we can't use the 5% to get them to passing. If they've passed, then they'll get a 5% credit, and that may or may not, depending on the scoring, but probably, given the BA, would probably put them in the top 3 and get you exactly what you want. And the chief knows how we think around here, and that we're very concerned about this. The chief's concerned because the chief had to go. You know, he's one of us. He had to get that BA the BA before he became a lieutenant. So he's probably got the same feeling as some of the existing lieutenants. But the and you know, I've given this a lot of thought. The practicality here is something we cannot live on acting lieutenants, and number one, to even do that, it has to come back, I think, every 30 days to us for approval. It just isn't the way to run a police department in today's days and age. But I would support that 5% passing grade. After the passing grade, the 5% credit for the BA, if that's something you could handle.
Right.
Mr. Chairman.
Along that line, and you mentioned, I believe, Chief, that there were 34 sergeants now that could take the exam.
No, Mr. Chair, we have in total, we have 34 sergeants in the department.
Okay.
But not everybody meets a requirement to take these.
So my question is, I'm wondering if there really is a problem at this point, because unless you've done a survey to find out of those 34 sergeants, A, how many would be interested in taking the exam, and B, and more importantly, how many of those have the BA or BS degree, we're kind of solving a problem possibly that doesn't exist.
And we have done those informally, so the information is not entirely accurate, but number one is we probably have a dozen or so in the organization that would meet the educational requirement currently. And the second part, we have those that do meet the requirement that have absolutely no desire whatsoever to promote and have no intention of doing so.
So rough guess right now, based on that, if we weren't to approve the education part of this, how many candidates do you think would apply?
I think probably 6 to 8.
6 to 8.
Don't forget, Mr. Chairman, we had already ran this through, and we had 8 applications. So we've done this once, internally.
And that may be a bit optimistic.
Okay, and over the next 2 years, again, in your presentation, you gave some sort of projection on how many vacancies you would have.
Right, and it could be anywhere from 8 to 12. And we have to realize that these testing processes are not easy. They will in and of themselves carry a 30 to 50% failure rate.
Well, in the last go-round, we had a 75% failure rate.
That is correct. These are demanding positions to be a police commander, and so the candidates are put through the rigors in terms of the interview panels.
Okay. Did you have any more?
I do.
Yes, please continue.
These are now my comments. I think my fellow commissioners understand this and know this. I am not a person that supports doing anything that doesn't increase requirements or keep them at the status quo. I have done, as I've indicated before, much soul searching on this. I've done some research on this. I know for a fact one of our neighboring cities has openings for police lieutenants. They do not require a BA. They're in the newspaper advertising for them. Now, one of them, Mr. Allen or Mr. Milano, said, well, we don't necessarily need to be as low as some of the other cities. The truth of the matter is we have a practical issue. We are just not getting the response. We don't have the backfill currently to do this. So I'm leaning toward doing something I almost have never done, and that is approving this. However, I'm not satisfied with just a case by case issue. I think we need to have, I've been convinced that the standard should be how many units are left, but I think we need to have because I think you've indicated to me some are just a few units away. So I don't have a problem with somebody being enrolled, but that by the end of the probationary period, there need to have 15 units or 12 units or 14 or 13 or something in that area, which is a reasonable, if I'm hearing from the chief, doable, 12 if you want, but that we have given a standard to the chief, and I think I don't think that needs a case-by-case basis, because I think from what I'm hearing the chief say is, then we know where we are, how serious this person is. If they're just a few units away, and I have no reason not to believe that, Chief, I'm not questioning you, then that's an easy standard. That person's going to meet that, probably be done with it by then. Maybe only need 5 units, so it's something that's very, very doable. But if we've got somebody that's 20, 19, 18 units away at the end of the probationary period, I just don't necessarily want to have that person stay on there, and I think we need to have a standard set here. So I'm not sure I'd leave it on a case-by-case basis. But, Chief, you can always convince me.
Mr. Gantis, maybe a thought suggested by staff just now is what about setting the standard as taking that individual and requiring them to have completed 50% of the remaining units necessary to complete their degree within the first year?
Yeah, but if they have 30 units, then if they have 60 units, then they've completed 30, and that's no good.
Well, if they complete 30 units in the first year, I think that would be.
If they had 60 left to do,
that would be very good.
Well, but if they had 60, no. Well, yeah, but they may not complete the other 30. And what you're telling me is that 12 in a year is a lot.
Well, I think 12 per semester is a demanding
semester. Oh, okay, semester is a different part. Okay.
It's a demanding caseload for academics.
I could live. I need a standard. I could probably live with 50% if that's what you think makes sense. But I need a standard. I'm sorry, because I'll tell you why. You said it yourself. I don't know that Chief Ron DePomp is going to be here 1 year from whenever we hire these lieutenants. We don't. I mean, I love to say you will, but who knows?
Never know.
The spirit moves you, and some of the I mean, you said it.
Right.
We have a very, how do I say it diplomatically?
Tenured.
Thank you. Tenured senior staff, led off by the very tenured chief of police that we're very fortunate to have, may I add. And we don't know that, and that's why I don't necessarily want to leave it to whomever we hire that doesn't have the history as a chief. I mean, it could come from within, may not come with, as you've indicated. We don't always hire from within for that. So does that work, Matt? Do you believe with that 50%? Fellow commissioners, we're not happy with that, Mr.
Well, I mean, it seems like the analysis is ongoing on your side. I do have a question with...
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, let's let Mr. Ganis finish.
I'm finished.
Vote yes, so...
Oh, we're not taking a vote. No.
But you were kind of pulling...
So with that, I would be supportive, subject to obviously some more commission report. I'm not happy about it, believe me, but with that, I could probably support the proposition. I'm done.
Okay.
I may.
It's actually proposing
That we...
approving. So.
No, I can't approve anything. I'm saying proposing...
I'd like to clarify this.
That we amend it. I'm sorry. I would be supportive of any proposal if it came up for a vote, with the exception that we add that by the end of the probationary period, any successful candidate will have completed 50% of their remaining units to attain the degree of BA or BS. And I am through.
Well, and if I may just chime in. Ultimately, we're trying to make the best decision for the city and the police department. And I understand the circumstances under which we're in, which is unique in the sense that we're trying our best to get as many candidates as we can from within. But by no means are our hands tied behind our back, because we have the secondary element of this examination, which opens it up to the outside. Comparing ourselves to our neighbors, that I'm having a little trouble with. creating a new standard, whatever that may be. We can sit here and come up with the specifics as to what the new standard will be and create a new civil service rule and allow this to be used by other departments as well. That I have a little bit of problem with, which I think if we do set a new standard here and if we do have unique circumstances of this nature again, whether it'll be the police department or fire, then we might have to afford them that same opportunity.
We're not changing a rule. You understand that?
And with that said, if we set precedents, we may have to offer this to other departments, and I think we'll all agree on that.
Yes.
And with that said, I think that's why we have our legal counsel, and what I want to do, I would like to refer to our legal counsel pertaining to some of the ramifications that we may have to adhere to if we do set a new, unique standard for the city of Glendale, which will apply to all departments to, in some sense, enhance their minimum requirements, whether it'll be by 50%, whether it'll be by 75%, whether it has to do with education or just experience. Minimum requirements is a broad qualification that includes experience, that includes education. If we say we're going to take 50% of your minimum required education, who's to say that we can't take 50% of your experience as well, and so on. I just don't want us to go down a road and create this new precedent that may, in turn, tighten us down. There's another aspect to this. I'm sorry if I'm prolonged. There's another aspect to this. I understand that this minimum requirement is enabling us to open the door to other possibly qualified candidates. But in sense, if you look at it, if you're enabling other candidates to apply, it's also being narrowly tailored to other possible candidates that we want to put into this possible banding or polling list. So we may look at it on one sense and say, yes, we're opening the door to other possible candidates who don't have the education requirements. But the way that it's written, it may be interpreted, if it's put in front of the right members, it may be interpreted as it being tailored towards a specific group of people who are not qualified. And so, considering all the circumstances, I would like to refer this to our legal counsel, and maybe you can just give us a rationale as to what your input is.
Well, I can comment on the first point that you raised, Commissioner Hatami and members of the Commission. The issue of setting a precedent would have to come back to this board. Anytime the department wishes to amend a spec, it would have to come back to this board, and it would have to pass the decision of this board in making that amendment, be it switching an educational requirement or doing something different.
Okay.
So each time it would have to come back to the board, and each time the board would have to go through the same deliberation it is doing now.
Okay. So either way, however we take this, that whatever standard we set now, do we have to afford that same opportunity to other departments who are under the same or similar type of circumstances?
Not necessarily, but it is something that if it were a different department and had the same issues that the chief is raising, those are certainly consideration points that you would think about and make a decision of whether or not the situation is similar and whether or not you'd wish to afford the same amendments to the spec as you're considering now.
Thank you. And if I may still go on. I do have a few more points that I think we should take into consideration before we do a final vote. Looking on the examination on the first page, and it starts off on the last sentence. It says any examination will be to evaluate the candidate's education, experience, knowledge, and skills for the position.
Where are you? I'm sorry.
I am on the last sentence on the first page. I'm looking on the supplemental amendment. It starts off the last sentence on the page.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
And it carries into the second page. Mm-hmm. It goes into any examination will be to evaluate candidates' education, experience, knowledge, and skills for the position. Looking at this sentence, ultimately, we are putting equal weight on education, experience, knowledge, and skills for this position. So, if you are attempting to set up a mechanism that is fresh, and I'm assuming this is boilerplate and we copy paste the stuff in, what we've been using then ultimately that process, if we want to get that technical and create a new mechanism and make this more of an objective formula or a process, then my recommendation would be, if, not that I'm open to it, but if the commission is leaning towards that it gets specific and we have a definite form of process that we can rely upon. Secondary thing is, even on the first page towards the end, it's the last sentence, it says, internal candidates will be given priority. With us setting this new precedent of attempting to, whether it's a 50% educational experience and including the sentence that internal candidates will be given priority, I understand that, Chief, our desire is to promote from within. We don't want to have sergeants within the Glendale Police Department who have been here for a long time to not feel as if though they're not given an equal opportunity. That's definitely not my desire or the Commission's desire. However, if we do, and I don't want to say bend backwards, of setting an educational experience that I think for this city is well deserved, for the pay for this city, and I think just the community leaders and the community themselves want a higher standard for police officers. I'm having a hard time approving a class specification for a meal coordinator where all the minimum requirements had to have been satisfied at the time the application was considered. And where I'm dealing with a lieutenant's position, which is a high-paid, highly regarded, a very high standard within this community, I'm having a hard time being able to split the education requirement. And then when we insert that internal candidates will be given priority, yes, that is our desire. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this community will be just as well served if you get somebody who is extremely well qualified. You know, we have citizens here who make great, great arguments. And I praise them because they have a very good point. I mean, we don't have murders here, but when we do, we may have to go to outside agencies. And it's not that that's not okay. That is very okay. That's what we need to do. But to bring in people who are qualified, I don't think we should be so hung up on we need to only bring in people from Glendale PD who are sergeants and who will qualify and bend backwards. And this is not just my affiliations. It has to do just with what I truly, sincerely believe is good for this community. And so I present this argument to the Commission. My full desire is to maintain a high standard for our lieutenants. It's a high-paid position. The amount of authority and management that they have within the city is highly regarded. Glendale City, highest-paid police department, the greatest police force I know. And so therefore, I want that standard to remain. And I'm sure we all do. Citizens, the chief, I mean, this is something that we all have in common. And so my recommendation is to maintain it as is. If not, if we do want to bend backwards for our sergeants and attempt to go for internal promotions, then there needs to be a specific standard that we can be ensured, will be fair to all members who are applying. And that's just basically my take on this whole thing. Considering the background, I do want to praise the background process that you have set out here. That's a great background. The poly and life scan and a full, thorough background into their personnel files, that I praise.
And Mr. Chair and members of Commission, Mr. Toomey, if I might respond just briefly to a couple of your points. I do think that there are quality candidates from the outside that could come in and fill leadership positions if needed. But we have great leadership potential within the organization. We have individuals in the ranks of our sergeants that are more than capable of answering the leadership call and taking this department forward. The issue is whether or not they're going to decide to enter the process and compete for the positions. That is part of the challenge. The other part of the challenge, as noted, is there are some that we think will be excellent leaders that are close. And my position is that we can provide reasonable safeguards to ensure that they do get to that educational standard in short order, and that can fill those applicant ranks and give us an opportunity to promote from inside first and foremost. I really believe that. I believe that we've got the capability internally to staff all our command positions from chief on down. So whenever I leave, I think you're going to have some very capable internal candidates that will be more than capable of stepping into the position that I vacate. And I believe that across all ranks. And I think what we're asking for you here is that with reasonable safeguards, give us a little leeway to bridge this gap. I think this is a unique period in time. Obviously, we just promoted two very talented young lieutenants that are going to be here for a long time. And as we get more of those type of individuals into the ranks, there won't be a necessity to do exceptional measures such as this in the future that I foresee. So that's what we're asking you is number one, let us continue to work internally to encourage those that would have eligibility to apply, and we're doing so. And number two, give us a little leeway with reasonable safeguards to expand that pool a little bit with good quality candidates that we know exist.
Thank you, Chief. I appreciate your patience, and I respect your answer, and I appreciate this intellectual dialogue that we're having. And if you were to ask me, do you believe that experience weighs heavier than education, I'd have to say it depends on the circumstances and the position. I sincerely believe that when you're dealing with high-level positions, that education does bring a whole different element and character to that individual. And I understand the circumstances under which we're in. And I respect you, and I respect your answer, and I respect your patience. But however, I think we respectfully differ on this one.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Mr. Gregorian.
Wow, you guys are going to run for city council? I mean, those are excellent speeches. I mean, I'm very impressed. Chief, I'm not clear on a couple points, and I don't want to go through technicalities because even though the public who is watching us and would like to kind of clarify that exactly what we are talking about. So the point is this, that we are lowering down our standards in order to cater some of these 34 sergeants that we have inside the city, and to help them, encourage them, and elevate them, bring them up to as a lieutenant position. In the meantime, that's one question. Is that correct?
Mr. Commissioner, that is correct. That is our intent. Again, we think that we have people that are very close to meeting the requirement that would make good lieutenants, and we want to give those individuals an opportunity so we can broaden our candidate pool.
Okay, now, number two, is that the understanding that I have is that we are opening our doors in the meantime, going to Southern California or wherever, I mean, that we have openings over here, come on down, we would like to, that come over here in our city and be a lieutenant, and therefore we have some special requirements and background and education requirements and all these kind of things. So practically we are going after the good ones outside, and we are trying to help the groups that we have over here, and in order for the next couple, 2, 3, 4 years, whatever, to establish a solid, a good police department. So where is the problem that I cannot see, that if you're going outside, are we going to bring down, why should we bring down our level of expectation from outside? Inside we understand, fine, it's our kids. We have to help them. You know, some of them, they're bad days or good days, and during examination they made mistakes, and we are here at the, the city that try to help them. But for outside, what can we do? And that's come that whenever the fellow commissioners we're talking, or I mean today, that we don't want to change these standards. It's going to be a quicksand for us in the future, because that's going to create a big problem. So what can we try to formalize a system that we are going to be comfortable for outsiders and for insiders and the future of a police department or any other departments throughout the city?
And Commissioner Gregorian, let me try to respond to that in that, again, I think there's quality candidates from the outside that could come in and do the job. I think it is most desirable, though, however, to defer to our internal talent first and foremost. I think, again, that we have very, very talented, capable people in the organization that will make good leaders going forward. And if we encourage more to change your mind and put in for it, and if we give a little leeway to those that are close that might make good candidates, we may be able to meet our needs strictly with internal candidates. But we don't know that for sure. And again, at the end of the day, we have to provide this department and this community a valid leadership team. So in the event that we can't get those internal candidates, I've got to have a mechanism to fill vacant positions that are vacant currently and that are on the immediate horizon. And so I look at the internal list, the open list, as kind of an insurance policy for us to ensure that we're going to be able to fill a management team in the immediate future. My hope is, and my true belief is, that we've got the talent and capability to do that internally. We may have to do a few things that are out of the ordinary here to bridge the gap. I think this is a very situational thing. It's not a permanent thing. I don't think it degrades our commitment to an educational standard at all. I think what it does, it gives a little bit of leeway to those that are close to enter the process. And again, as I've stated, that I believe as your chief that is in the best interest of the department and the community at this point in time. I may not say that in 6 months or a year. It may be an entirely different situation. But based upon what we know now, and based upon the recent experience we had with the past promotional where our applicant pool was dismal compared to what it should have been, this is my recommendation to you.
Okay. I do have a couple of comments also. Before I do that, I want to ask Mr. Doyle just another academic question. When a person is promoted to a new position and they have the year of probation, at what point does that person vest in the retirement for the pay at that position?
Very good question.
Chair Devine, under our current retirement formula, presumably with all the individuals that would apply from within, they are vested already. But as far as in the new position, we have what's known as the retirement formula that looks at the single highest year of one's salary, and therefore it would be their highest year of salary, which would be the baseline with which their retirement is set. So all it would take is 1 year.
1 year, okay.
Yes.
With that, after hearing all the comments from my colleagues, I think they all brought up excellent points. My feeling is that right now we have a problem right here in River City. And looking at the big picture, we need to solve that problem. And my colleagues have brought up a lot of what-ifs, in the future as far as setting precedent and all that. I think those are good points, but right now that's not going to solve the problem for us. The other thought I have is that we have a chief who we all greatly respect, and I feel that we ought to leave this in his hands as far as how he needs to run his department in order to best protect the city of Glendale. And with that in mind, I certainly concur with his proposal, and I understand that the GPOA has also accepted in principle the things he's proposed. So I think conceptually that we need to drop the what-ifs at this point and look at what we can do to solve the problem. And we have that before us. The only problem I have with this, and the Chief mentioned these key words, and I appreciate that, said we need to have reasonable safeguards with this system. For me, the reasonable safeguard is to be able to enforce the education requirement. Right now it's set at 2 years they have to obtain the BA or the BS. And I have a problem with that because knowing the process we would need to go through should a candidate not comply with that within the 2 years, it's very onerous. And it could end up being where I think one of the speakers mentioned, there could be lawsuits involved, et cetera, et cetera. So what I would like to do is provide a reasonable safeguard, and Commissioner Gantis mentioned this, to tie the milestone in to the probationary period. In other words, at some point before he passes probation, the chief needs to make a decision on whether or not he has met the requirement. And to me, the 2-year requirement is not a viable way. So I think we need to explore that, if my fellow commissioners would agree with me, and make it possible that the person could be demoted if he didn't reach X expectation by the time he's ready to be evaluated for probation.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry. Are you done?
Not yet.
I apologize.
Okay. So with that in mind, I would again be in favor of adopting this proposal, but putting in the safeguards that Mr. Gantis has alluded to in terms of, well, actually two things: the bonus points for on the exam for the people with, well, you mentioned 5%. Mr. Doyle, that would be 5% of what on the?
Chair Devine, that's an excellent question. And it does warrant some further discussion on this issue. The way the veterans preference points are set forth in these rules, it does provide for additional points based on a percentage of the score. It's not a clean 5 additional points or 7.5 points or 10 points. So that's one thing we'd want to clarify. The way the veterans credit points are addressed, for example, if an individual has a score of let's say 80%, and they are granted 5% additional points for having attained veterans credit, you would essentially multiply the 80% times 5% or 0.5 to get the additional points that would go into this. So that would amount to actually a score, that would raise that individual score from 80 to approximately 84%. So it's a percentage of the individual's final score that is what that additional scoring is. So if that makes sense to you, that's.
Now I understand where you.
We could do it that way, or we could just say we would add 5 points, period, and leave out the whole percentages. So if the individual scores 80, they have their degree, it's 85 points is their final score. Either way, folks.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
My proposal was that it be based on the veterans, that it be a 5%, whereas Mr. Doyle said from 80 to 84. If it were 90, it would go to 94.5, which is 5%. That's what's consistent with what we do with the veterans, as I'm reading the rule right here. So that would be my proposal, rather than a certain number of points. Let me ask this, though. It did raise a question. May I, Mr. Chairman? Mr. Doyle, I know that the lieutenant, this is more on an oral. Do they get points? Do they get an actual score from the boards that they go through on the lieutenant's exams?
Sir, Commissioner Gantis, each component is scored individually.
By a score?
Yes.
70, 30, 60, 80?
There are rating. Each of the interviewers fills out rating sheets, and those rating sheets are converted into a numeric score, and then those scores are added together, and that a we arrive at a final score from which the list is based.
Mr. Chairman, I would propose then we use the veteran one, which is 5%.
Do we have concurrence with, assuming they would vote for this, does that seem like a reasonable? Greg?
Thinking.
I have a question. Is this at the time, this 5%, is this at the time when the application is submitted or when the banding is done? When would this be considered?
Sure, Tommy, and it would be at the conclusion of the process, after the individual has made it through each of the respective phases of the exam, and then they would then have those points added to their score.
And this would be to individuals who currently or at the time have the minimum requirements as far as education is concerned?
Yes, sir.
No, have a BA. In other words, the BA or BS.
The degree, yes.
And for individuals who are enrolling and are in the process of obtaining, during the time when when DHR does the banding, are they going to be considered in this 5% or are they going to be outside?
That is a good question, but we intended to conduct this exam in a timely manner, probably within the next 2 months. So the assumption would be that those individuals not meeting it would not get those points at the time of the exam.
And then just one final follow-up: the 5% increase. Are we going to do a banding process, or how is that going to be allocated as far as level of priority or consideration by the decision maker?
Commissioner Hatamian, City of Glendale does not utilize banding. Under our charter and civil service rules, we go off the rule of 3. So essentially, when the exam is completed and we tally up the scores, we would then add those preference points for those with the degrees to the final score, and then that score is what would establish the rank order on the list at that point, and that's what the list would be based upon. And under a promotional and open system, assuming there are outside candidates, we would thus have to certify all of the internal candidates first, or go to that list first, before going to the open portion of the list.
And the outside candidates would also be afforded the same 5% increase, or are they going to be excluded?
Let me just... That intended to be for the outside candidates as well? Is that how the bulletin is written?
We may have an issue with that.
Mr. Chair and members of the Commission, I think this would be a preference that we'd give to internal candidates. I don't think that would be an issue that we'd expect of the external candidates. They're coming in with a management certificate and a BA degree. So, again, my preference would be to focus on our internal candidates.
That would be the direction that
There's a lot of lieutenants that don't have
Just want to get Lucy's intake.
within 2 years.
Ms. Farpedian, do you have any input on that?
Is there an issue if within the internal candidates we afford them the 5-point increase if they hold a BA, and we don't afford outside candidates the same increase, whereas with veterans credit that applies across the board, and this is how this started out? So is there an issue with that? Do you see any legal ramifications?
There's actually 2 questions. One having to do with the attainment of the degree in general, and then the secondary part of it is those who have it. Well, I guess one question answers the other. Those who have it would get the points, so I guess it's the same.
Those who have it internally, he said, is what's being said.
The question that you're raising, Commissioner Hatamian, is whether or not the same credit could be applied to the outside candidates. You would have 2 different lists. So those individuals who are on the promotional list who have attained that and are eligible for the credit would rise up in their own list. And if the same was applied to the open list, then those individuals would rise up on their own open list. Am I correct, Mr. Doyle?
That's correct.
So if we have somebody from the outside and if we have somebody from the inside, okay, and they both have the educational requirements, the individual on the inside is going to get additional 5 points. And my question to you is whether or not that's fair, whether or not we're going to be facing any lawsuits and legal ramifications if we set this standard where the outside applicants are basically, if they have the same requirements, are not getting the same amount of points.
I don't believe so. You could have a different requirement. But the individuals who are on the promotional list will be considered first. So that list would be exhausted first before going to the next list. So it's certainly within your purview to determine whether or not you'd like to have two different requirements or standards for the two different lists.
To a degree, that's what's being proposed here relative to the experience requirement, whereas internal candidates were proposing to meet the traditional 2 years as a Glendale police sergeant, whereas if we're entertaining the thought of bringing in outside people, we're asking that they be at the rank of lieutenant. So we're already doing that, and again, I'll leave it to the commission to determine whether or not you feel the educational component should be same or different.
Well, if I understand correctly, though, if we afford that bonus to the external candidates, it's kind of a moot point. It will not impact or affect our internal candidates at all.
That's correct. But it would impact their ranking on the open list in comparison to other candidates from outside of the organization.
So with that in mind, I would have no problem affording the same thing for both lists, giving them all the 5%. As long as it doesn't impact in any way our internal candidates, I don't think it makes a difference.
That's because we're having an open promotional, which is, as they've said, we have to exhaust our promotional list before we go to the open list. So, for instance, if we were to have a similar test where we got 2 promotionals that passed, and let's say we had 4 open that passed, the 2 have to be, am I correct, Matt? Tell me if I'm wrong. The 2 have to be exhausted, then they can go to the open and hit that list.
Actually, the appointing authority is entitled to 3, so they could have 2 internal and 1 from the outside consideration.
The one from the outside have the 5% bonus, and the next one on the list would have the BA degree, which is something that would be advantageous.
And then it's left to him to make that decision.
I think that at least that would be my vote.
I agree.
As far as
Plus the probation that you mentioned, that was very
right.
probation period that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, I wanted to get into that. Did you have any more comments?
I was just going to say, considering everything that we're doing and the fact that, and I think it's a good idea, the fact that we're keeping it fair across the board, inside and outside, just to reflect that, and this is just a recommendation, to possibly take out, and I know this is going to be done internally, take out the sentence that says internal candidates will be given priority. I know subjectively that's what we want. However, the issue that I'm having is the individuals that are now going to be included in this canvassing, the fact that if we make these changes, if any one of them actually ends up with this position, there may be other legal issues that might come out of that. And so therefore, I'm trying to maintain as even-handed as I can as far as this process is concerned.
Mr. Chairman, I would, with all due respect to my learned commissioner, would not be supportive of that because 2 reasons. Number one, this was handed to us tonight, that internal is added, and my guess is that's part of what we allowed the continuance to go forward with so that the parties could negotiate that. And I still want, I think it's important that we make the statement from the City of Glendale that we are going to support our internal candidates. And I think that's what the GPOA and the brass and the management, the tenured management, had negotiated, and I'm not about to not go along with what they negotiated. We have the president of the GPOA here, who I haven't heard from, so I assume he's in agreement with all of this. And I would be supportive of leaving it in because this was a very tenderly negotiated issue. It was a very volatile issue, and I want to be sure that we're taking care of our people. And the right way that they qualify.
I agree with you, and I think we are. And I think the fact that we spent the last 2 hours, hour and a half discussing this issue, and the fact that we are setting a whole new mechanism for internal applicants to have the opportunity to apply, and the fact that I think we all mentioned it at some point that we do want to encourage our internal applicants. The only thing that I was suggesting by possibly considering the removal of that statement is for the mere fact that we want to, sort of outside community who is interested in applying, be as fair as possible. That's all. So I leave that up to my commissioners. I know we can edit it. I know this was discussed. And I see the chief shaking his head, so I'm just wondering whether or not you have any input regarding this last part of our little discussion.
Commissioner Hatami and members of the commission, Mr. Chair, again, our intent is to favor our internal candidates first. I think that is most healthy for the future of the organization. So I think that was the intent of that statement, but your point about presenting a fair and even playing field to all the candidates, internal and external, certainly makes sense. And we can certainly support your proposition.
Thank you, sir, and I'll leave that to your discretion and to the commissioners.
Mr. Chairman, we have our lawyer.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, I'm referring to Rule 5, Section 2B, which cites to the order of list utilization, and it states eligible lists will be utilized in the following sequence. Number 1, layoff list, or if none exist, 2, promotional list, number 3, reinstatement list, number 4, then open list.
Again, that's the basis of the promotional and open list preference.
So that discussion
So the
has...
sentence basically is...
That discussion has taken care of one of my reasonable safeguards, and that is giving the level or a fairer playing field to the internal candidates with the BA. The other thing is, and I still need to explore this as far as my concern is on the ability to demote during the probationary period. The other question, along with that, I have a question. You mentioned if you're in a position for 1 year, that vests you as far as the retirement formula. Is that, did I understand correctly? If you get promoted to lieutenant and you're in that position for 1 year and then you retire, you're entitled to the pay, a percentage of the pay that you had at the lieutenant level. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So,
single highest year.
Okay. So with that in mind, how could we couch this proposal so that should that occur, let's say that someone gets promoted and the chief has the ability to not pass them on probation because they didn't meet the education requirement, whatever that may be when we determine it, how can we couch this so that they also would not be entitled to that pay for that year or less that they would spend at the lieutenant level?
So, Chair Devine, I don't believe there's anything we can do about that. The state law under what's known as PEARL, which is Public Employment Retirement Law, states very clearly what the vesting requirements are and the various retirement formulas entail. And an employee's base compensation, as well as extra pays, if it even for 1 year escalates due to a promotion of this nature, that would form the basis of their single highest year for retirement.
All right. Is there a way we could change the probationary period to say 11 months so that this would be resolved within 11 months? The person would not have the year in that position, and we would not be subject to having to pay the higher retirement.
Chair Devine, that wouldn't help the problem at all. It might help it a little bit, but it is based on the single highest year, and instead of having 12 months at this pay level, you'll have 11 months at this pay level and 1 month at the previous pay level. So it would still cause an escalation of one's income for that period of time.
All right. Well, with that in mind, I would ask Mr. Ganis if he would like to suggest a fair way of dealing with the number of units completed during the probationary period that would be a benchmark for demotion or continuation?
Mr. Chairman, I think your points, as all the Commissioner's points, are well taken. In my discussions with the Chief, I think what he proposed, and I would be willing to go along with it, is that that by the end of the probation period, any successful candidate will have completed 50% of the remaining units needed to obtain a BA and BS degree, or BS degree, required at the time of his hire. In other words, if the candidate needed 20 units at the time of his hire, that candidate would have to show that he or she had completed 10 units by the end of the probationary period, or that would then be subject to termination without having to go through the civil service. As the Chief has indicated, the challenge, the practicality is, we're not, and he's convinced me of this, that we're not going to get candidates that need 60 units that are going to be able to do this in 2 years. They just simply cannot do this in 2 years. We're more likely to get 30 unit or less candidates because they are, and in some instances, I'm hearing the Chief, we may have candidates that are 10 units away, 12 units away, 16 units away. So what we're just going to ensure is that they enroll, and that so if they have that 20 units when they are enrolled and hired, that they must complete 10 of those units by the end of the probationary period. I'm satisfied with that, and I think that works in my mind to give us protection. One of the things, Mr. Devine, your concern about the retirement was my concern. I didn't vocalize it because it was an issue, and not much we can do about it. But I think if we impose this requirement that we will have obtained a person that's probably going to be within 10 to 15 units or less of completing a BA or BS degree, and have gotten that person's, if they don't, will have gotten that person's services as a lieutenant, so that we really are attaining somebody that's very, very close to somebody else, so that we will have gotten, as I'm sure your implication is, that we're getting our cluck for our buck. We're getting the person to do the work for the city of Glendale that we would expect for that person, so that we can give them the appropriate retirement. Yeah, there's the possibility that they're not going to complete it, but in all practicality that I'm seeing after hearing the Chief and in our discussion, I think we're going to get close enough that it's worth the risk, given, as you quite rightly point out, the very unique circumstances we have here.
Okay. Any more discussion from any of the commissioners?
I do agree with you, Mr. Gantes, and I do think that we are making the right effort towards encouraging internal growth. But I do think that when, and I'm thinking subjectively, within my mind, if I know there's a position that I want to go for in the future, I prep myself. And I start slowly going towards the direction of obtaining the education that I need in order for me to one day, when that examination is open, for me to possibly apply. And so therefore it shows an effort. I would say the only way that I would be convinced of this process would be if we have individuals who are not only enrolled, but in my opinion, at least halfway through the process in obtaining their educational requirements. Simply being is because, number one, they've taken the initiative. Number two, those are the individuals who are close, who are almost there. And I'm being very conservative by saying halfway through the process. So this is just food for thought for the Commission, and I'm not sure if my fellow commissioners agree with me on this or not.
Mr. Chairman, you could sell me on that. The problem is, if we put that in there, now we are really getting into the hiring process. I think we've heard the Chief, and we can't do that. I think the Chief's heard us. I don't think the Chief's here to make somebody that's not going to put somebody in there that doesn't have a plan for success. because and so I think by just the practicality of it, it's there. And with the 50% requirement, we can really ensure, the chief is going to look at it and say, is this person really capable of doing it? And quite frankly, nobody with less than 50% remaining or more than 50% remaining is going to be able to do it, because they just are not. And more than 30 units, let's say, because that would be 30, so I'm not sure that would work out. I'd leave it to our counsel if I'm just not sure that legally, by putting that in there, we may be getting more into the hiring than we're getting into the restrictions, but I leave that to counsel.
Members of the Commission, I don't think that would be into the hiring requirements. It would just be another condition of the minimum requirements that you're proposing.
And I think, however we take it, we are in the preliminary screening / hiring process. So however you take it, we are the ones who ultimately set the standard for the future lieutenants that are going to serve this community. And as members of our community, I believe that to set a standard, the minimum standard, let's not forget, was a bachelor's degree for a lieutenant. We are making an exception here because we feel as if though internal candidates are going to better serve this community. At the same time, now is when we have to act a little bit even-handed as well in placing some burden on the individuals who are in the process and basically seeing whether or not they actually took into account that one day they would be applying for a sergeant position and if they're taking any positive steps towards that. I think that's the very least at this point that I personally myself would take into consideration in improving this mechanism that we're setting up in order for us to promote internal promotions.
Mr. Chairman?
Would you repeat your suggestion again?
My suggestion is to ultimately have a higher standard pertaining to the amount of units that have been completed at the time that they file for their application.
What would be your suggestion?
I have a suggestion.
Discussion. So we're currently...
May I, Mr. Chairman? What I think I hear you saying is that in order to be a successful candidate, must meet the requirement in 2 years, must have 30 or less, 30 being half, 50, as you said, 50% of the way from an AA degree to a BA degree, 30 or less units to be completed, and have completed 50% of their remaining units by the end of 1 year. Is that what you're saying, Mr. Hatamian?
To simplify it, at the very least, an applicant should have, in my opinion, have their AA or their AS,
it's already out.
And then half-way completion of their bachelor's.
That's the 30 degrees then. I mean, 30 units, 30 or less.
Yeah, it all depends on if you're taking into account the AA and the AS degree as well. So it depends how you're counting your units.
I think you have...
So if you're including the AA and the AS, it'll be an increased number.
Ms. Varpetian, did you have something?
I just wanted to raise a point of clarification. There are 2 points I think that you're raising. The first is that at the time of the establishment of the eligible list, that the candidates have completed at least 50% of the educational requirement. And then the second point, which was being raised, was that at the before the end of the probationary period, that they have also met at least, at a minimum, 50% of the remaining requirements to achieve the bachelor's degree.
At the end of the probationary period, which would be within a year?
Yes. I think what he's saying, though, is that he wants them to have an AA degree, which I agree with. That means at least approximately 60 units.
11 months.
Nobody that's going to be hired that needs 60 units is going to be able to complete that in 2 years. That's just a physical, am I correct, Chief? That's just not going to be able to be done to do the job.
Mr. Chair, members of Commission, that is correct. That's our assessment that would be a Herculean task to complete. But let me remind the Commission that as eligibility for being a sergeant internally, they have to have completed 60 units. So they are, just by virtue of being a Glendale police sergeant, are going to have half the requirement of meeting their BA requirement at the lieutenant's rank anyway. So they're going to come in internally with half of that as a baseline.
Does that answer your question? Yeah.
And so if we have, well, and I'm just referring this to everyone who may just enlighten me on this, if you have 60 units completed by a sergeant, and there's a remainder for them to complete in order for them to obtain their BA. Prong one would be to have them 50% of their bachelor's program completed, not considering the AA and the AS. And then now prong two would be to determine what would be a fair amount of units that they would have to complete within the year that they're on probation.
That's what I was saying.
So now we
They've
need to
got-
ultimately come up with a number that we think may be fair for them to complete within a year, and then we may have a ballpark.
Mr. Gaddis?
I'm sorry, I keep speaking. I apologize, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate your input.
What I was saying is, since if they have the 60 units, if that's all they have, they need 60 more units. From that standpoint, practically speaking, it can't be done. So what I would say, in order to make it sure it's practical, if that works, and the chief, everybody's, is that they have, the successful candidate will need, the remaining units, once they're hired, are 30 or less, okay, which is now they're 70, that's 50% of the way from the AA to the BA. And that after 1 year, they will have completed 50% of the remaining units that they have.
30 units.
If it's 30, if it's 20, we use the 20, then they will have completed 10. If it's 30, they will have completed 15 at the end of the probationary period.
So what you're saying is, to apply, they need to have at least 30 units.
To be successful, in other words, if they're going to be chosen, they will have 30 or less units remaining to obtain their BA or BS degree. And then after that, they will have needed to complete 50% of what they had remaining at the end of 1 year. Does that work, Chief, or you think that's too restrictive?
Mr. Chair, members of Commission, I think that that would work. That provides a standard. However, I think you're cutting a fine line when you're dealing with trying to get candidates into the process. What if someone's 32 units short or 35 units short?
You just told me you didn't think they could get more than...
Well, I think it was 60 units to complete in a 2-year period. I think it would be very difficult because you're essentially having to carry a full-time academic load while working full-time. I don't think that's doable. My only concern with your proposal at cutting it at 30 units is that what do you do if you have a great candidate that has 32 units left? And I think we're cutting it rather fine here. I think maybe those assessments would be best left to the HR department and the police chief to make those assessments.
At this point, where would you draw the line? What would be comfortable for you?
Well, and again, Chair, Mr. Chair, is that I think we really have to look at it at an individual basis. I think certainly if you have a candidate that still has 60 units to complete, that's simply not going to be doable. But you may have a candidate that has 35 or 40 units that may be working the type of an assignment, perhaps patrol, where they're working a 3/12 shift, and they're very capable of putting in the time to get the units done.
You can't.
So it really depends. Obviously, someone working a 3/12 shift in patrol is going to have more access and availability to go to school. Someone working, for example, an investigative assignment or vice narcotics or a task force may not have that type of time availability. So we really have to assess it on an individual basis.
Mr. Chair.
Okay. Let me interrupt right here. Mr. Milano has been passing notes to me 3 times and the other commissioners once or twice. He says he has a practical solution to this. Since it is not an oral communication but an agendized item, he wants to be able to come back and speak. I was going to ask the city attorney, first of all, what the protocol was on that, and secondly, ask my fellow commissioners if they would like to hear again from Mr. Milano, assuming it's within the jurisdiction.
Mr. Chair, we generally permit individuals one opportunity to address the commission or the council on both during oral communication and also on items that are part of the agenda. But if for whatever reason the commission wished to make an exception, keeping in mind that you'd have to do that moving forward and making it fair to each time that you received a similar request, then that's something that you can consider at this time. It's within the chair's purview.
Okay. Well, I'm going to ask my fellow commissioners whether or not they would like to hear again from Mr. Milano, and you've all received his little note saying he has a solution to this problem. Mr. Ganis, what is your...
I will defer to the chair.
With that in mind, I will ask Mr. Milano to come up and give him 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Devine. As I was sitting here, I was wondering if you're going to limit the requirement with regard to education, why not look at the current courses that these sergeants have taken to see if they are relevant to their position? And you may not need the other courses that are more generic in nature. For example, one of the commands is Violent Crimes Bureau. Within it, you have Assault and Youth Crime Detail. Now, if a particular lieutenant does not know, for example, about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or let's assume for a moment that a sergeant has taken courses dealing with the impact of ADHD on youth, that is the kind of education that is to which individuals may be exposed in the college environment, which is incredibly relevant, because then they would know that neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine and dopamine have an impact on these children that is beneficial. So in part of their training, a lieutenant training a sergeant, bringing that level of knowledge forward is incredibly valuable for the community, because they then know how to treat a particular youth. Now, that knowledge has come to bear recently in the last 10 years. So someone with 20 years experience may not necessarily be aware unless they were exposed to it in a college environment. So if you have the type of courses that the chief feels are prerequisite to becoming a good lieutenant, they may not need the additional credits with English literature and who knows what else that may be a requirement for a bachelor's. What's important are the courses that they have taken that are relevant to their duty as lieutenants. And this is one example that I feel is relevant, because I personally have interviewed policemen who were in charge of the youth crime detail a few years ago, and they did not know about attention deficit disorder and the way that the youth determine them, and how they treat this youth and how they address the criminality or their perception of criminality of the youth is incredibly important. What's important is how the community is impacted by the type of leadership that you bring in, and for that leadership, what's important is the type of education they have had. I wouldn't care if they need to get additional courses in literature in order to get their bachelor's degree. Is irrelevant. Is the courses that maybe should be stipulated to make it relevant to that position. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Milano.
This many left.
Mr. Ganis, did you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm still wrestling with this, with the chief's. I want to be sure we're being fair here. I see the chief's point, because I think maybe I'm prepared to just limit the restriction to the 50% that I'll leave to the chief to determine what he thinks somebody can complete in that period of time, but that 50% of whatever's left, and that, chief, I would take it you would have to have a transcript from every applicant, a transcript of what that probably they've had to have been in school, and that you will have to get some sort of a certification of how many units at that time left they have, and if you're doing it now, if they're enrolled right now, how many they're enrolled at present to do this. Is that basically how you see that?
Commissioner Gantis said that is correct. Before I appoint, I do an interview of the top 3 candidates, the names that are submitted. Part of that interview process will be a verification through their transcripts as to where they are at in the process.
Wouldn't that be done prior to their being a successful, wouldn't that be part of their eligibility requirement?
Well, it would be part of their eligibility requirement to apply. That is correct, but it'll be reaffirmed at my level when I do the pre-hire interview. And at that time, it's very easy then to set very clear expectations as to what needs to be completed in that probationary period and what the consequences would be should they fail.
Matt, and I would ask this to Matt, if we were to, I see, okay.
Let me ask the chief, based on Mr. Milano's comments regarding looking at the specific courses they've taken in the evaluation process, what would be your comments on that?
Mr. Chair, members of Commission, I do believe that those comments are valid. Certainly, we look for a nexus to the job. I think the best place to assess that is actually in the interview process. The interview panels can look at resumes, applications, courses completed, and that is certainly part of the panel's assessment as to that candidate's preparation. But once that is completed and they're placed on the eligibility list, we would not go into that level of review in terms of their coursework.
Very good. Thank you, Chief. Okay. Mr. Doyle, you had your hand up.
Mr. Chair, I just had a brief comment with regard to there's some discussion about should we make a minimal requirement, educational requirement, what would be realistic that a particular candidate would be able to attain. I would encourage you to remain somewhat flexible on that, as Mr. Gantis had suggested. There are some reputable bachelor degree programs that are out there that are highly accelerated. I realize 60 units in 2 years is, I agree, that's a near Herculean task, but there are some programs that are highly condensed, and they involve reputable schools like
Woodbury and Laverne and Cal State Long Beach that can offer accelerated programs where 20, 30 years ago it would have been completely impossible to have attained that level of education in such a short amount of time. But there's a real market for these types of programs and a high demand. And there are programs where literally individual is meeting one night per week for 5 hours, 5-hour blocks for a period of a year or year and a half. And a lot of progress can be made in those types of accelerated programs. So I'm not an expert on these programs. I went to school the old-fashioned way, which took the normal time. But I know there are programs out there, and I would think that someone who's either very close to getting their degree or maybe 30, 40 units away, it could be possible realistic to achieve that in a 2-year time frame. So,
okay, I think we've.
I'm prepared to make a motion.
Well, I was going to say we need a motion. I think after 2 hours and whatever minutes of discussion, I think Chief DePompa has gotten a great idea of the direction the Commission's looking at, and I'm sure he's going to adhere to that. And so I'm going to ask Mr. Gannis if you'd like to make a motion.
Do we need to, Ms. Varpetian, do we need to take them separately, the specs separate from the bulletin?
You do not.
Okay.
I'm sorry, you do not.
I will remind you on the spec, we talked about including the specific discipline under the police lieutenant, police.
What discipline was that? Maybe I'm...
Police science, business administration, administration, or a related field, as it's listed for.
So my motion would be for the job specification that we add to the educational requirement of the police lieutenant, that my move acceptance of the job specification with the following amendment, that to the education requirement of the police lieutenant, we add that the BA or BS degree, well, we want the same language, is that it? Because it doesn't say you need to have a bachelor's degree in police science on Captain. It just says you have to have major coursework in police science, public administration, or related field. Is that what you want to use that language, Mr. Chairman?
Well, first of all, I don't think anything's changing in the captain, so we're just looking at the...
No, I know, but that language, you don't need to have a BA in a police
No,
science.
well, I do want to put in, and I think Mr. Doyle said rather than delete that requirement from the captain...
No, we're going to put it into...
Yeah.
So instead of a BA or BS degree required with major coursework in police science, public or business administration, or related field.
Yes.
With that amendment, by that change, I would move the job specification, and additionally, I would move the acceptance of the job bulletin with the following change: that under education and training, that where the parents in bold under that the successful candidates must meet this requirement within 2 years from the time of appointment, and additionally have completed 50% of the... Just a second. No. And then going on to the next sentence, candidates not possessing a bachelor's degree at the time of appointment must provide proof of college enrollment in a pursuit of a bachelor's degree at the time of appointment and complete 50% of the remaining units to attain the bachelor's degree within the probationary period of this position. Does that make sense?
Okay, and also...
With that, I would approve... I'm sorry.
I think we need to do a couple more things. Also, under education and training, we need to add that same wording in there, Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science degree in 2 fields or 3 fields we talked about.
With the major work in the fields.
Parallel the job specs. And somewhere in here we need to add the bonus points.
Yes, and that would be under selection process where it says... Am I correct, Matt? I'm not sure how you put the but I think where it says internal candidates will be given priority, comma, and those persons possessing a Bachelor's of Arts or Bachelor's of Science degree at the time of their examination will be entitled to a 5% language say in there.
Educational preference credit.
Educational preference credit.
Okay.
Is that the appropriate place, Matt? At the end of the selection process? Yes.
Yes.
That's my motion, Mr. Chairman.
Is there a second?
With an amendment only. Onto Commissioner Gantis's motion.
What you need to have the motion on the table. So if it dies for a second, then you can make a new motion, or you make a second and then propose an amendment, and then the motion person has to accept it or not, and then you vote on that motion, or you can have the motion die without a second.
I'm going to ask Mr. Gregorian, would you second that motion? Well, let me make it easier. I'm going to pass the gavel to Mr. Gregorian, and I will second the motion.
No, I don't want to be the hero. I'm going to be the hero for police department. I am second the motion.
Okay. All right, so now we have a motion, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry.
There's been a motion and a second. And
Yes.
a roll call.
No, I think he wanted to do an amendment. There's a discussion.
There is a discussion.
Oh, a
You want to
discussion?
discuss that motion, Mr. Chair?
Pardon me?
You want to open up the discussion on that particular motion and entertain the amendment as was proposed?
Okay.
Just amendment on, and this is, I'll give the rationale before I give the amendment. It's very simple and quick. If we're going to have individuals apply who are enrolled and have to complete 60 units within 2 years, I make the motion to have the individuals have it completed 50%, which equals to 30 units, at the time of filing the application, and to complete the remainder, which is the additional 30 units, within the 2-year period in order to avoid what Mr. Doyle brought up pertaining to cramming 60 units within a 2-year period. So my motion is to simply amend Mr. Gantis's original motion to have the candidates have had their units completed 50%, which is 30 units at the time when they apply, and to complete the remainder 30 units in a 2-year period of their filing.
Let me comment on that. I believe
Well, what you got to the amendment. The amendment has to be acceptable to the maker of the motion. If not, then you have to take, and it's not acceptable to the maker of the motion.
becomes a moot point.
Well, then you can vote on the motion. If the motion doesn't pass,
We'll have
then
roll
he can
call.
make a new motion.
We'll have roll
Unless
call.
there's more discussion, Mr. Chairman.
I have a question
Yes?
regarding amendment.
Yes.
I would like to see if it's practical, that motion. Is it possible? Is it feasible? Because it's easy to put a motion, and then if it's not possibly feasible, then we're wasting time.
In answer to that, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, fellow commissioners, we already had that discussion, and it was turned out it was not practical, and we decided to leave that discretion up to the chief when he evaluates the candidates. Rather than add in that requirement for the 30 units when they apply, we're going to leave it up to the chief to let him decide whether or not there's a possibility of their meeting that requirement. So I think we've already discussed it, and we already decided that that would not be a practical way of handling this.
Mr. Chair, if I may, and I agree with you, one area we did not address as far as practicality was whether or not it is practical to have candidates complete units in a 2-year span of time, as the original motion of having them complete a bachelor's degree within a short period of time. If they come in having completed some of their credits, it makes it a little bit easier for them to complete the remainder.
And that's
what the chief said he was going to do. In other words, correct me if I'm wrong, Chief, that you stood up here and said that if somebody comes in and they needed to complete 60 units to get their BA or BS, they would not be a viable candidate because it's impossible to do. But if they came in and they only had 30 units to complete, then he would consider them and judgment feel that they could do the 30 units. So without putting the requirement on there up front, we're going to leave it to the discretion of the chief to decide what is practical for that particular candidate to complete the requirement within the 1 year.
Okay, so could we, on Mr. Gantis's motion, do we agree that we can have candidates who enroll, are not in the bachelor's program, enroll and file and have met the minimum requirements?
yes, but the chief would determine what he thinks they can do in 2 years. Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. What they can do in 2 years, and what my motion requires, just so you're clear, is that if he has determined at the time of hire that that person needs 20 units to complete the bachelor's degree, that they must have completed by the end of their probationary period 1 year, 50% of what's left, or the 10 units. So all that would be left is 10 units. Obviously, if it's 30 units, then they have had to complete 15 units. That's what my motion requires. So whatever he has in the way of he hires I'm sorry. Mr. Doyle had something.
Chair, maybe I can offer a suggestion. Candidates not meeting the bachelor degree requirement, that we simply require them to have either an AA or 60 units at minimum for entry to this process.
And I would be agreeable to that.
If that helps, Commissioner Hatamian.
Okay, so we're basically approving the original supplemental application with
the change on the 5%, the 50%, and adding that the successful candidate will have attained an AA. Is that what you're suggesting, an AA or AS degree?
Realistically, anyone who has anything less than that is not going to be able to meet.
I don't have a problem with that.
And the 50%, is that within the 1 year probation?
50% of what's remaining. Somebody may have already. What I'm hearing the chief say is there may be people out there that have 12. They're going to finish by either February or June. They've got 12 or 20 units left. Whatever they have left when they're appointed, 50% of that left has to be done by the probationary period, and that would
Yeah, okay, that's what my motion says.
And we also have do we still include the 5%?
Yes, that's the credit. That's the credit for having it at the time of the examination. So they have to have that at the time. It's those people that come in and apply with a VA degree that get that 5% credit.
Agreed.
Chief, please.
Mr. Chair, members of Commission, just as a note that to be a sergeant you have to have 60 units, and that would be a baseline we agreed to apply for the lieutenant's position, but I would caution you not to restrict it solely to having an AA or AS degree, or that it would include the equivalent of 60 units.
60 units.
So AA, AS degree, or 60 units is what would be required. And again, every sergeant candidate that applies will have that as a requirement to be a sergeant.
I don't have a problem with that.
So with that, can we take a vote? Adam,
You're the chairman.
Ernie, well, I'm asking. I've been corrected 4 times now.
Give us your motion again, Mr. Gantis.
Oh, my goodness. All right. It's to approve the job specification. Boy, it's really testing my memory with no dinner at 8 o'clock at night. Job specification proposed, motion to approve that with the following change to the education requirements for a police lieutenant, that the police lieutenant have a BA or BS degree with major coursework in police science, public or business administration, or related field. And further, that we approve the job bulletin proposed with the following change. Change your language. Under the education training, that in the parenthetical portion of the language, successful candidates must meet this requirement within 2 years from the time of appointment. And then the next sentence, candidates not possessing a bachelor's degree at the time of appointment must provide proof of college enrollment in a pursuit of a bachelor's degree at the time of appointment and have completed a minimum of 50% of the remaining units that candidate had at the time of appointment to obtain a bachelor's degree at the end of the probationary period. Additionally, under the language and selection process, after the bold language that says internal candidates will be given priority, we add a comma, and an educational preference credit of 5% will be given to all applicants who possess a BA or BS degree at the time of application. That's my motion.
We had the motion.
Second.
Second, roll call.
Commissioner Hatamian?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Council's giving me, that with respect to the language on the education, that the completion of the 50%, completing 50% of the remaining units shall be done prior to the expiration of the probationary period. That's what that language, that's Council's advice to me, and I agree with that.
Please continue with the roll call.
Commissioner Gregorian?
Yes.
Gantis?
Yes.
Devine?
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Chief, get us good lieutenants, will you please? Especially those fine officers out there, all of them.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming in.
Including the one in the back.
Okay, may we have the next item, please?
Resolution, unclassified temporary positions, update on American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, personnel status and extension request.
Mr. Doyle?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this item is a resolution updating our unclassified temporary employment list that was last visited
approximately 2 years ago. What we're seeking to do is to extend some of the unclassified status position, extend the unclassified status of several positions within the Community Services and Parks Department, stemming from the ARRA stimulus funds that were released by the federal government back in 2009. It's hard to believe it's been that long, but when these positions did come out, the Civil Service Commission did approve certain numbers of these to be unclassified, temporary, and the reason we do that is because the funding for these positions was intended to be temporary. There's no intent to grant these individuals civil service status. At that time, the Commission approved the establishment of 15 positions as unclassified, exempt from civil service. Ultimately, after having gone through selection processes, the department only hired 12 of those individuals. But at this point, with the uncertainty of a lot of the ARRA fundings, we're now requesting that only a small number of these be extended for further unclassified status. Most of these are being extended not due to the ARRA stimulus funding sources, but rather other areas where staff has been successful in getting grant funds to continue these programs. As it is now, this resolution is seeking a total of 5 positions to be continued as unclassified in the Workforce Investment Act area, 2 caseworker 1s, 1 program specialist, 1 administrative analyst, and in the Community Development Block Grant Program, specifically in our Homeless Services Program, we're requesting 1 caseworker 2 be granted unclassified status, and we're seeking an additional 2 years on this through September 30th, 2013. With that, Commission, if you have questions, we have staff here available to answer them. We also have Jess Duran, who sat through this entire discussion of the police lieutenant, as well as Don Nakamoto, who is our Workforce Investment Administrator. And, of course, my staff member, Steve Nersessian, is here if you have questions on this.
Any questions from the...
Just one quickie. The ones that are under the workforce development grants, those grants are funding these for the 2 caseworkers, 1 program specialist, and 1 administrative analyst, and those are funded through the period of time we're extending it?
We believe we will have the funding through.
And if we don't, then they can be subject to being laid off because we don't have funding.
Yes, sir.
Move the approval of the request.
Unanimous consent. Next item, please.
No, I think it's resolved. Remove the approval of the resolution. Sorry.
Agenda forecast.
Mr. Doyle?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, we have your agenda forecast, our upcoming meeting. We anticipate a report on our the quarterly advertising budget expenditures report. We also will have the annual HR activity report. That's a significant effort by our staff to reflect all of the human resources and civil service activity for the 2010-2011 fiscal year. So we will have that on October 26th. And we do anticipate some closed session items relative to some of our current disciplinary appeal cases. Additionally, on November the 9th, we will anticipate having a report on, and it's not listed here, but Commissioner Manukian had asked for some information on how the CalPERS system works, and so we're preparing a brief report on CalPERS. So we anticipate that for the November 9th meeting. And then we have our holidays upcoming where we'll miss 1 meeting each in the month of November and December. So.
Okay, thank you.
It's a report.
Next item, please.
Reports and information, past due employee performance evaluations.
Mr. Ganis, would you like to go through those, please?
Okay, yes, thank you. For the departments that have no past dues, we thank the city clerk's office. We thank the city manager's office. We thank the city treasurer's office, fire department, Glendale Water and Power, police department, and public works. We have a total of 26
notices, both first and second, no third notices outstanding out of 1,720 salaried employees.
Okay, thank you. Next item.
Closed session, public employee discipline.
Okay, we'll be reporting the closed session, and completion we will report out. This will end the televised portion of the meeting. All those who are not involved with the closed session, we'll ask you to please adjourn at this time. Thank you.